The air in the grand hall was thick with the scent of sandalwood and unspoken dread. Upon the dragon throne, elevated high above the sea of bowed heads and trembling officials, sat Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. His gaze, sharp and unyielding as polished jade, swept over the assembled court. He had unified the warring states with fire and blood, forging a single empire from the fractured remnants of old kingdoms. But the peace he had bought was a brittle thing, and he knew that unity once won must be maintained with an iron will. Today, he would announce the mortar that would cement his legacy, a new era of absolute rule, built not on loyalty, but on the bedrock of pure, unadulterated fear. A single scroll, held in the emperor's own hand, seemed to suck all the light from the room. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, resonant command that carried to the farthest corners of the silent hall. Each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his terror. He spoke of a new order, a perfect obedience, where dissent was not merely a crime but a cancer, to be cut from the body of the state with merciless precision. He detailed the new laws, a web of absolute control where a whispered question could be construed as treason, and a furrowed brow an act of rebellion. Then came the punishments. He described them not with anger, but with the cold, dispassionate tone of a master architect outlining his blueprints. He spoke of flaying and dismemberment, of bones ground to dust and families erased from history for the sin of a single member. He painted vivid pictures of public spectacles where agony would be the main performer and the collective horror of the populace the intended audience. This was not merely justice. It was pedagogy. Each scream would be a lesson, each mutilated body a textbook on the cost of defiance. A new silence descended, heavier than before, as the courtiers understood that the man on the throne was no longer just a ruler, but an architect of suffering, and they were all merely materials for his grim designs. The decree was not an announcement. It was a storm cloud that had finally broken, and the rain that fell was made of blood and impending screams. The era of fear had officially begun. The silence that followed the emperor's decree was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from terror and disbelief. It stretched across the grand hall, thick and unbroken. As the assembled courtiers kept their eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, each man a statue of perfect, petrified obedience. The scent of fear was now a palpable presence, mingling with the sandalwood, a sour, metallic temps that clung to the back of every throat. They had heard the emperor's words, the cold, meticulous descriptions of agony, but such horrors belonged to the abstract realm of law. They were concepts, nightmares not yet given flesh and blood. That abstraction was about to be shattered. From the ranks of the scholars, an old man named Lin stepped forward. His robes, though fine, were worn at the cuffs, and his back, once straight with academic pride, was slightly stooped with years of study. But his eyes held a fire that the emperor's words had not been able to extinguish. He had devoted his life to the teachings of Confucius, to the idea that a ruler's virtue was the foundation of a stable state. The decree he had just witnessed was the absolute antithesis of everything he believed in. It was not order. It was a descent into monstrous tyranny. Profound, foolish courage, born of a lifetime of principle, overrode the instinct for self-preservation. He lifted his head, his voice, though thin with age, cutting through the oppressive quiet like a shard of glass. He spoke of the mandate of heaven, of how a ruler who governed through terror lost the right to rule. He criticized the new laws not as a rebel, but as a teacher correcting a flawed lesson, his words a calm, reasoned argument for mercy and wisdom over brutality and fear. For a few heartbeats, his voice was the only sound in the universe, a lone, brave note in a symphony of silence. He spoke of history, of dynasties that had crumbled from within when their foundations were built on the suffering of their people. The emperor did not move. He did not interrupt. He simply watched from his throne, his expression one of detached, almost bored curiosity, as if observing a peculiar insect that had dared to crawl onto his boot. The scholar's words were not an attack to be met with rage, but a problem to be solved, and the emperor had just provided the solution. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The reaction was instantaneous. From the shadows behind the great pillars, the imperial guards moved. They were not soldiers of the field. They were instruments of the throne, their faces impassive masks, their movements a synchronized and terrifying ballet of efficiency. They did not run. simply flowed toward the old scholar, their armored boots making no sound on the stone. Their hands, encased in leather, closed around his frail arms with impersonal force, yanking him away from the center of the hall. The fire in his eyes guttered out, replaced by the dawning horror of realization. But the lesson was not complete. Emperor's new justice was collective. With the same chilling efficiency, a second detachment of guards moved through the stunned crowd, identifying the scholar's family from the court registers. His wife, her face a mask of stunned disbelief, was seized. His two sons, young men whose greatest crime was their bloodline, were dragged forth. Their protests were muffled by gauntlet hands, their struggles useless against the immovable force of the state. The court watched a gallery of frozen portraits, each man holding his breath, each one understanding that they were witnessing the first vital stroke of the emperor's new design. This was the example. This was the translation of law into reality. The silence was no longer just fear. It was complicity. The scholar Lin was dragged from the silent hall into the blinding glare of the central square, his family torn from his sight and hauled away to the imperial dungeons. The transition from the shadowed, incense-heavy court to the open, sun-drenched plaza was jarring, a shift from whispered dread to the stark theater of punishment. The square, usually bustling with merchants and citizens, had been cleared and encircled by a wall of imperial guards, their spears forming a bristling barrier that kept the populace at a fixed, compulsory distance. In the center stood a simple wooden frame, its purpose horrifyingly clear. Lin was stripped of his scholar's robes, the fine fabric tearing under the guard's rough handling, leaving him shivering and exposed in his thin undergarments. His dignity was the first thing flayed away. His wrists were bound with coarse rope to the horizontal beam of the frame, stretching his aged body taut, the skin of his back pale and vulnerable against the dark wood. The crowd, pressed forward by the guards, was a sea of averted eyes and hushed, fearful breaths. Men held their children's faces to their legs, but they themselves were forced to watch, their own terror a secondary punishment for the crime of witnessing.
Ow!
The executioner stepped forward, a hulking man whose face was hidden by a leather hood. In his hand he held not a sword, but a multi-tailed whip, its leather strands tipped with jagged pieces of bone and metal. He took his position with the practiced ease of a craftsman at his bench. There was no ceremony, no reading of charges. The emperor's decree was the only warrant needed. The first crack of the whip was a sound that split the world into a sharp, sickening report that echoed off the surrounding buildings and was followed immediately by a choked cry torn from Lin's throat. A line of bright red welled up across his shoulders. The second lash came before the echo of the first had died, then a third, a fourth, falling in a relentless rhythmic torrent. The jagged tips did not just sting. They bit and tore, shredding the thin skin and biting deep into the muscle beneath. Each impact was an explosion of pain that arched the old man's body against his bonds. His cries began as shouts of protest, appeals to heaven and reason, but they quickly devolved into raw, animalistic screams that had no language, only pure, undiluted agony. They echoed across the stone plaza, a terrible soundtrack to the spectacle, each shriek a hammer blow on the nerves of the onlookers. Blood soon matted his back, running in dark rivulets down his legs to pool on the dusty ground beneath the frame. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of it, mixing with the dust and the smell of sweat and fear from the crowd. The flogging seemed to last for an eternity, measured not in minutes, but in the number of times the scholar's voice broke and reformed into a new, more desperate pitch of suffering. The executioner did not tire, his arm rising and falling with mechanical precision. The lesson was not in a quick death, but in the prolonged public dismantling of a man. Parents clutched their children tighter, their own faces pale, teaching them without words the new price of speech. By the time the whip finally stilled, Lin hung limp from his bonds. His back a grotesque tapestry of shredded flesh and pulped muscle, his breathing a wet, ragged gasp. The square fell into a silence more profound than before, heavy with the shared trauma of what they had been forced to see. The emperor's first example was complete. Its message seared into the memory of the city, not with ink, but with blood and echoing screams. The next demonstration of the emperor? Justice was reserved for a man of higher station, a former minister, whose whispered, Doubts in private chambers had somehow reached the dragon's ear. His crime was not public defiance but private treason, betrayal that demanded a punishment far more exquisite and prolonged than a mere flogging. The chosen method was linky, the slow slicing, a form of execution that elevated agony to an art form and death to a meticulously delayed ceremony. The minister was brought to the same square, but the apparatus awaiting him was different. A stronger, sturdier frame held him upright. His limbs spread and bound tightly to the beams, leaving every part of him exposed and immobile. A basket was placed nearby, its purpose grimly evident. The executioner this time was a different sort of artista, man of calm precision, his movements economical and focused. His tools were laid out on a small table, an array of knives, each with a specific purpose, their blades honed to a cruel, glittering sharpness.
Oh.
The process began not with a violent strike, but with a series of careful, shallow cuts. The first blade, thin and precise, traced lines along the minister's chest and arms. Parting the skin with the delicacy of a calligrapher's brush, blood welled up in thin, precise beads, tracing the patterns of the cuts. The minister's initial reaction was a sharp, shocked intake of breath, his eyes wide with the dawning horror of what was to come. There was no single overwhelming wave of pain, but a rising tide of 1,000 individual stings, each one a tiny, focused point of fire. The executioner worked with unhurried concentration, his focus absolute. He would make a cut, pause, select another knife, and make another. Each incision deliberately placed to maximize suffering without inducing swift unconsciousness. He removed small pieces of flesh, placing them almost ceremoniously into the waiting basket. The agony was not a blunt force, but a sharp, escalating symphony of pain, each note perfectly placed to build upon the last. The minister's screams were not the ragged, uncontrolled cries of the whipped scholar, but sharper, more desperate sounds, each one ripped from him by a new, precisely administered torment. As the minutes stretched into a horrifying hour, the executioner moved to more substantial work. Larger pieces were methodically separated from the living whole. The focus was on prolonging the process, on maintaining life and awareness within the crumbling vessel of the body for as long as humanly possible. The crowd, compelled to watch, witnessed not a frenzy of violence, but a chillingly calm dissection. Some turned away, retching, only to be forced back to attention by the guards' prodding spears. The lesson was in the details, the way a hand could be rendered into a bloody ruin while the heart still beat. The way a man could be systematically unmade, while still being aware of his own disassembly. The minister's world shrank to the universe of his own agony. His voice grew hoarse, his screams fading to wet, guttural rasps as his strength ebbed away with his blood, which now darkly stained the ground beneath him. Yet the executioner's work continued, a testament to terrible skill and imperial will. It was a performance designed to demonstrate that under the new order, even a high-ranking life was not simply taken. It's deconstructed, its value measured out in slices of flesh and prolonged seconds of suffering. When the final, merciful cut finally stilled the heart, what remained was not a man, but a testament to the emperor's absolute power and the terrifying artistry of pain. The emperor's gaze was a physical weight in the throne room, colder and more unyielding than the marble pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling. Before him stood General Meng, a man whose armor still bore the dust of northern campaigns, whose face was a roadmap of scars earned in loyal service to the very throne that now judged him. The charge was treason, whispered not in the heat of battle but in the quiet corridors of the palace. A rumor given life by the emperor's own deepening paranoia. There would be no trial, no examination of evidence. The emperor's suspicion was its own verdict, and the punishment had already been prepared, a new invention, designed to be both spectacle and symbol. In the center of the hall, a throne had been placed. It was a brutal, ugly thing, forged from black iron and shaped in a crude mimicry of the dragon throne itself. But this was no seat of power. It was an instrument of agony. Their coals radiating a hellish heat that made the air above the iron seat shimmer and dance. The metal itself glowed with a dull, ominous red, the heat so intense it could be felt across the room. This was the Emperor's new justice, a perverse coronation for those accused of coveting his power. Guards, their faces set in masks of grim duty, seized the general. He did not struggle. His military pride held him rigid, even as they stripped him of his armor and his tunic, leaving his torso bare and vulnerable. They dragged him toward the shimmering throne. The smell of scorching metal filled the air, acrid and metallic. As they forced him backward, the first contact was met with a sound that would haunt every witness of violent, hissing sizzle as the skin of his back and thighs met the superheated iron. The general's body convulsed, a violent, involuntary spasm of pure, unadulterated agony. A guttural roar was torn from his throat, a sound of such profound shock and pain that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. His flesh did not just burn. It cooked and fused to the metal in an instant. Oh, the smell that followed was worse than the sound. The nauseating, sweetly foul odor of searing meat, thick and cloying in the air. The guards held him fast, their own hands protected by thick, soaked leather, pressing him down onto the throne as if bestowing a terrible honor. The Emperor watched from his elevated dais, his expression one of detached, analytical interest. He did not smile in cruelty. He observed the effects of his design with the cold focus of an engineer assessing a new machine. The general's screams became continuous, a high, ragged keen of unimaginable torment as the heat devoured him from the outside in. Wisps of smoke curled up from where his body met the iron, and the sizzling continued, a grotesque counterpoint to his cries. His skin blackened and split. The fat beneath bubbled and popped. The agony was absolute, a fire that consumed nerve and sinew, locking him in a single, excruciating moment of being burned alive while pinned in place. His eyes, wide with a horror beyond comprehension, remained fixed on the Emperor, the source of his suffering and the audience for his dying moments. The lesson was clear for all the silent, petrified courtiers to see. To aspire to the throne was to be consumed by it. The Emperor's power was not just absolute, it was elemental, a force that could forge empires and just as easily reduce a loyal general to a sizzling, screaming offering on an altar of iron and fire. The general's form eventually stilled, his cries ceasing, leaving only the faint, sickening crackle of cooling flesh and metal, and the profound, terrified silence of the living. The Emperor's gaze was a physical weight in the throne room, colder and more unyielding than the marble pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling. Before him stood General Meng, a man whose armor still bore the dust of northern campaigns, whose face was a roadmap of scars earned in loyal service to the very throne that now judged him. The charge was treason, whispered not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet corridors of the palace, a rumor given life by the Emperor's own deepening paranoia. There would be no trial, no examination of evidence. The Emperor's suspicion was its own verdict, and the punishment had already been prepared, a new invention designed to be both spectacle and symbol. In the center of the hall, a throne had been placed. It was a brutal, ugly thing, forged from black iron and shaped in a crude mimicry of the dragon throne itself. But this was no seat of power. It was an instrument of agony. Braziers glowed fiercely at its base, their coals radiating a hellish heat that made the air above the iron seat shimmer and dance. The metal itself glowed with a dull, ominous red, the heat so intense it could be felt across the room. This was the Emperor's new justice, a perverse coronation for those accused of coveting his power. Guards, their faces set in masks of grim duty, seized the general. He did not struggle. Dads, his military pride held him rigid even as they stripped him of his armor and his tunic, leaving his torso bare and vulnerable. They dragged him toward the shimmering throne. The smell of scorching metal filled the air, acrid and metallic. As they forced him backward, the first contact was met with a sound that would haunt every witness of violent, hissing sizzle as the skin of his back and thighs met the superheated iron. The general's body convulsed, a violent, involuntary spasm of pure, unadulterated agony. A guttural roar was torn from his throat, a sound of such profound shock and pain that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. His flesh did not just burn, cooked and fused to the metal in an instant. The smell that followed was worse than the sound, the nauseating, sweetly foul odor of searing meat, thick and cloying in the air. The guards held him fast, their own hands protected by thick, soaked leather, pressing him down onto the throne as if bestowing a terrible honor. The emperor watched from his elevated dais, his expression one of detached, analytical interest. He did not smile in cruelty. He observed the effects of his design with the cold focus of an engineer assessing a new machine. The general's screams became continuous, a high, ragged keen of unimaginable torment as the heat devoured him from the outside in. Wisps of smoke curled up from where his body met the iron, and the sizzling continued, a grotesque counterpoint to his cries. His skin blackened and split. The fat beneath bubbled and popped. Agony was absolute, a fire that consumed nerve and sinew, locking him in a single, excruciating moment of being burned alive while pinned in place. His eyes, wide with a horror beyond comprehension, remained fixed on the emperor, the source of his suffering and the audience for his dying moments. The lesson was clear for all the silent, petrified courtiers to see. To aspire to the throne was to be consumed by it. The emperor's power was not just absolute, it was elemental, a force that could forge empires and just as easily reduce a loyal general to a sizzling, screaming offering on an altar of iron and fire. The general's form eventually stilled, his cries ceasing, leaving only the faint, sickening crackle of cooling flesh and metal, and the profound, terrified silence of the living. The silence that followed the general's death was not one of peace, but of anticipation, a held breath waiting for the next act of imperial theater. The lesson of the Iron Chair had been personal, a targeted annihilation of a single powerful man. The next lesson would be broader, more insidious, designed to poison the very wellspring of loyalty and trust. The family unit itself. Before the coals beneath the gruesome throne had even cooled, the emperor's attention turned to the general's clan. His crime, though unproven, was deemed to have tainted his entire bloodline, a corruption that required total excision. At dawn the next day, the Imperial Guard moved not as a surgical instrument, but as a sweeping scythe. They descended upon the Meng family compound, not with the quiet efficiency used on a single scholar, but with the overwhelming force of a military operation. The heavy wooden gates were splintered open with a battering ram, the sound echoing through the quiet morning like a crack of doom. Inside, the household was thrown into panicked chaos. Servants dropped trays and scattered, but there was no escape. The guards moved through the courtyards and chambers with ruthless purpose. Their orders clear, not a single member of the clan was to be missed. They rounded up the general's elderly mother, her hands trembling as she was pulled from her prayers. They seized his wife, her face a pale mask of stunned resignation. His brothers and their families were dragged from their beds, children crying out in confusion as they were torn from their mother's arms. Even the infants, swaddled and innocent, were collected with impersonal efficiency. There were no distinctions made for age or gender, no considerations of innocence. The crime of one was the crime of all, a foulness that ran in the blood, and could only be purged by capturing the entire stream. The procession to the dungeons was a somber, horrifying parade through the waking city. The guards formed a tight cordon around the bewildered mass of humanity, over 50 souls, ranging from a babe in arms to a great-grandfather who had to be half-carried, his legs too weak to keep up. Their confusion was palpable, a cloud of uncomprehending fear that hung over them. Children clutched at the robes of their elders, their tears leaving clean tracks through the dust on their cheeks. The citizens of Shanyang watched from behind shuttered windows and half-closed doors, their own hearts freezing in their chests. This was a new kind of terror, one that did not just threaten the individual, but promised to erase entire lineages, to unravel the very fabric of kinship and safety that held society together. They were herded down into the bowels of the imperial prison, a place of perpetual damp and echoing despair. The heavy iron door of a single vast cell groaned open. There was no segregation, no attempt to sort the men from the women or the young from the old. They were pushed into the cold, stone-walled space as one collective entity, one condemned organism. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a tomb ceiling, the thick iron bar dropping into place with a deafening clang. Inside, the darkness was broken only by a single high slit of a window. The air was thick with the smell of mold, stale straw, and the salt of fresh tears. The children's whimpers mixed with the low, despairing sobs of the adults, all huddled together on the filthy floor. The punishment had not yet truly begun, but its psychological weight was already crushing a suffocating realization that they were all doomed for a sin not one of them, save the general now fused to his iron throne, had committed. They were a lesson in the making, a living testament to the emperor's new doctrine. Dissent was a seed, and to ensure it never sprouted, one had to burn the entire field. The lesson of collective guilt required a collective end. The following morning, the heavy iron door of the dungeon groaned open once more, not to offer reprieve, but to begin the final grim procession. The Imperial Guards entered the cell, their torchlight cutting through the gloom and illuminating the huddled, terrified forms of the Meng clan. There were no words of explanation, no reading of charges. Their fate had been sealed the moment the Emperor's suspicion fell upon their patriarch. They were simply pulled to their feet, their limbs stiff and cold from the night on the stone floor, and marched out into the harsh light of the execution square. The square had been prepared not for a single spectacle, but for a mass demonstration. Instead of one frame or one terrible device, a long, deep trench had been dug across its width. At its edge stood a row of Imperial executioners, their heavy swords resting point down on the ground. The crowd, larger than ever, and pressed forward by a denser ring of guards, watched in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. This was not the horrified fascination of watching a single man endure a specialized agony. This was the numb, chilling dread of witnessing a harvest of death. The family was divided not by choice, but by the rough hands of the guards, sorted into loose groups: the men, the women, the older children, very young. Those who could not yet understand were left clinging to their mothers' skirts, their confused whimpers, the only sounds breaking the tense quiet. The Emperor's new justice was efficient and brutal. There would be no prolonged torture here. The message was in the scale, the sheer, overwhelming number of lives extinguished for one man's alleged crime. The first group, the men and older boys, were forced to their knees at the trench's edge. They did not beg or cry out. Strange, resigned stillness had settled over them. The lead executioner raised his sword. The blade caught the morning sun for a fleeting second before it descended in a swift, practiced arc. The first head fell into the trench with a soft, wet thud, the body slumping forward after it. The executioner did not pause. He moved to the next man, and the next, the great sword rising and falling with a terrible, rhythmic finality. The sound was a series of dull chops, each one followed by the soft collapse of another body. The trench began to fill, a growing testament to the Emperor's logic. Next came the women, some shielding the eyes of the children who clung to them. They were forced down in the same manner. Their end was just as swift, just as impersonal. Some closed their eyes, whispering final prayers. Others stared ahead with a hollowed-out defiance, their last sight the blood-soaked ground before them. The swords rose and fell, and the trench accepted its grim offering. The youngest children, those without the strength to kneel alone, were held by guards for the executioner's blade. Their brief lives ended in an instant of shocking violence. The entire process was carried out with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. There was no rage, no ceremony, only the systematic group-by-group eradication of a family line. The square was filled with the coppery scent of blood and the low collective gasp of the audience with every fall of the blades. When it was finally over, the trench was a charnel pit, a jumble of bodies that had once been a family, now rendered anonymous in death. The executioners stepped back, their work done. The guards began shoveling earth over the carnage, burying the lesson along with the victims. The crowd was dismissed, shuffling away in a daze, each person carrying the indelible image of the filled trench back to their own families. Understanding with crystalline clarity the new, terrifying price of association, the Emperor had made his point. Loyalty was not just individual. It was familial, and failure was a contagion that would be cauterized from the Empire, house by house, soul by soul. The air in the execution square grew thick with the scent of hot metal, and bubbling fat, a greasy, nauseating perfume that announced the next act of imperial justice before the condemned even arrived. At the center of the packed earth ground stood a monstrous iron cauldron, wide enough to hold a full-grown ox, supported over a roaring fire by a tripod of blackened logs. Within it, a deep pool of oil shimmered, its surface rippling as heat gathered from below, sending up the first lazy, ominous bubbles. This was not an instrument of cooking, but of purification, or so the emperor's decree would claim. The condemned was Minister Chow, a man whose girth and fine silks spoke of a lifetime spent skimming from the empire's coffers. His corruption was an open secret, tolerated for years until the emperor decided it was time to make an example of Avarice itself. Guards dragged him forward, his plump body quivering not with fear, but with a desperate wheedling energy. His eyes darting around the silent crowd, as if seeking a reprieve that would never come. He was stripped of his luxurious robes, leaving his pale, soft flesh exposed to the jeers of the onlookers, who were encouraged to vent their own economic frustrations upon this symbol of greed. The emperor's herald stepped forth, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. He spoke not of punishment, but of cleansing. He declared that the minister's soul was befouled by his insatiable hunger for wealth, that the stolen gold and silk had corrupted him from within. The boiling oil, he proclaimed, was a purifying bath, a sacred fire that would scald away the filth of his avarice, and leave behind only the truth of his sins for all to see. It was a perverse baptism, a theological justification for an excruciating death. At a signal, the guards heaved the struggling minister up the small ladder placed against the cauldron's side. His shrieks began the moment his bare feet touched the hot iron rim, a preview of the agony to come. With a final, coordinated shove, he was pitched forward into the shimmering oil. The sound was not a splash, but a violent, hissing roar as his body plunged beneath the surface. For a horrifying second, there was nothing. Then he erupted back into the air, his form sheathed in the boiling liquid, his mouth open in a scream that was instantly choked by the oil flooding into his lungs. The pain was absolute and instantaneous, a white-hot inferno that consumed every inch of him at once. His skin, pale and soft a moment before, blistered and blackened in the searing heat, sloughing away from the muscle beneath. He flailed in the churning oil, a grotesque boiling puppet, his movements becoming more frantic and jerky as the oil cooked him alive from the outside in. The smell that rose from the cauldron was appalling, a mix of frying meat and burning hair that made the front rows of the crowd recoil and gag. His screams were short, wet burbles, cut off each time the oil overwhelmed him. Bubbles of air and something fouler rose and popped on the churning surface. The emperor, watching from a shaded pavilion, observed the spectacle with a look of cold satisfaction. This was the perfect lesson. It targeted a vice the common people understood and despised. It was spectacularly violent, and it wrapped the brutality in the language of moral righteousness. The minister's greed had filled his belly. Now it boiled him in a pot. The symbolism was crude, brutal, and unforgettable. After what felt like an eternity, the thrashing in the cauldron stilled. The body, now a swollen, grotesque thing, rolled lazily in the bubbling oil, pieces of it beginning to separate and float to the surface. The fire was left to burn, reducing the once powerful minister to little more than rendered fat and scorched bone, a grim stew of imperial justice. The crowd dispersed slowly, the image of the boiling official and the foul smell etched into their minds a potent warning that in the new era, even sins of the heart would be met with the fire of the state. The palace courtyard, once a place of serene beauty with its manicured willows and placid koi ponds, had been transformed into a gallery of living despair. Iron cages, crude and rust-streaked, stood in neat rows where peonies once bloomed. Inside each, a human being was on display, reduced to a specimen of defiance for the amusement of the court. These were the latest dissidents, those whose crimes were not grand enough for spectacular execution, but whose spirits required breaking through a more insidious, degrading torment. They were not prisoners. They were exhibits in the emperor's new human zoo. Men and women, some still wearing the tattered remnants of scholars' robes or merchants' tunics, crouched on the bare metal grating of their cages. Their eyes, once bright with thought or ambition, were now hollowed by hunger and a profound, soul-crushing shame. They were fed like animals, not at mealtimes, but when the mood struck the courtiers who strolled between the cages. Guards would toss handfuls of moldy rice crusts or rotting vegetable scraps through the bars, watching with detached amusement as the captives scrambled in the filth-strewn straw to retrieve them. The scraps were not nourishment, but a reminder of their reduced state, a deliberate erosion of their humanity. The courtiers themselves were the primary audience. their silk slippers whispering on the flagstones as they moved from cage to cage. They pointed with feathered fans, their laughter light and cruel as they commented on the gaunt faces and desperate movements of the caged souls. They mocked their former peers with poetic insults, comparing a once-proud historian to a chattering monkey, a principled merchant to a greedy pig rooting for slops. The air was thick with their perfumed scorn, a stark contrast to the stench of unwashed bodies and despair that rose from the cages. The emperor himself would sometimes descend from his pavilion to observe his living collection. He did not laugh with the courtiers, but watched with the same analytical dispassion he applied to all his instruments of control. He saw how the constant humiliation, the reduction of a person to a starving, caged creature, was a punishment more effective than any lash. It did not just inflict pain, it dismantled identity. A man who had to fight for a rotten carrot lost the capacity for rebellion. A woman forced to relieve herself in full view of mocking aristocrats had her dignity systematically flayed away, layer by layer. Days bled into one another under the relentless sun and the equally relentless scrutiny. The captive's skin grew leathery and burnt, their lips cracked from thirst. Their world shrank to the dimensions of their cages, their existence defined by the clang of the food bucket and the taunts of their betters. Some curled into fetal balls, retreating into the sanctuary of their own minds. Others stared out with a defiant fire that slowly, inevitably, guttered out under the constant pressure of degradation. They were living warnings, their broken forms a silent sermon on the cost of descent. A lesson in how the emperor could cage not just the body, but the very spirit of a person. The courtyard was no longer a garden. It was a menagerie of broken wills. And the most dangerous animal on display was not in a cage, but walking freely among them, the keeper of all their suffering. The emperor's justice had thus far been a blade that cut deep, severing limbs from the body of the state with brutal efficiency. But the punishment known as the 9 familial exterminations was not a blade. It was a fire intended to scorch the earth itself, to ensure that not even the memory of a dissident lineage could take root and grow again. It was the ultimate expression of the emperor's doctrine. Punishment so absolute it sought to rewrite history by erasing every branch of a family tree, from the deepest roots to the most distant twigs. The concept was chilling in its scope, a meticulously calculated genocide of kinship. It targeted not just the immediate family of the condemned parents, children, siblings, but reached back through generations and out across collateral lines with a terrible bureaucratic precision. The 4 paternal generations, the criminal's father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and all their male descendants. 4 maternal generations, the criminal's mother, her father, his father, and all their male lines. Finally, the criminal's own generation and that of his children, including his wife's family. It was a net cast so wide it ensnared great-uncles, third cousins-in-laws, and infants who had never learned the name of the man whose actions had doomed them. The punishment treated blood not as a bond but as a contagion, and its prescribed cure was total annihilation. The impact was a tidal wave of suffering that crashed through multiple generations of a single targeted clan. The elderly great-grandfather who had spent his life in peaceful obscurity, tending a small plot of land, would find himself dragged from his home by imperial guards, his aged mind struggling to comprehend the connection to a treason he had never heard of. A young mother, married into the family only a year prior, would be seized along with her newborn, their futures extinguished for a crime committed by a distant cousin she had met only at her wedding. Scholars, farmers, merchants, and artisans, all whose only shared trait was a fragment of DNA, were rounded up in a sweeping, terrifying dragnet. The terror it sown was of a different, more profound quality than the fear of individual torture. It made every family gathering a potential death sentence. Every familial connection, a possible chain that could drag one into the executioner's trench. It encouraged betrayal from within, as the only hope for survival for one branch was to denounce another before the imperial registers made the connection. It turned the fundamental unit of society, the family, into a web of potential peril, where love and loyalty were dangerous liabilities. A man could not simply control his own actions. He was now responsible for the silent thoughts and whispered words of every single person to whom he was connected by blood or marriage across a span of centuries. The punishment was a message written in the blood of entire genealogies. It declared that, under the emperor's rule, a person was not an individual, but a representative of their entire ancestral line, and that line's continued existence was contingent upon his absolute unthinking obedience. It was the final logical extension of the emperor's philosophy. To truly control the present, one must have the power to erase the past and cancel the future. The 9 exterminations were not merely a punishment. They were a declaration that the emperor owned not just the lives of his subjects, but their very heritage, and he would burn it all to ash at the slightest provocation. The man known as the Red Fox of the Western Hills had been a thorn in the emperor. Aside for years, a folk hero whose legend grew with every imperial patrol he evaded and every granary he raided to feed the starving. He was not a scholar or a minister, but a man of the people. His name whispered in villages like a prayer for deliverance. His capture, after a betrayed informant, led the imperial guard to his mountain hideout. It was a triumph for the throne, and his punishment was to be its masterpiece. He would not be simply killed. He would be meticulously, artistically unmade. His legend dissolved slice by agonizing slice under the bright, pitiless sun of the execution square. Bound to the familiar wooden frame, the Red Fox did not tremble. His body, lean and hardened by a life outdoors, was a map of old scars and taut muscle. His eyes, unlike the hollowed stares of previous victims, held a defiant, unwavering light, fixed on the distant horizon, as if already seeing a freedom beyond this pain. This unbroken spirit was precisely what the executioner, a man celebrated in grim circles as the Scalpel, had been summoned to extinguish. His tools were laid out with the reverence of a surgeon, an array of knives, hooks, and slender, razor-edged blades, each polished to a murderous gleam and designed for a specific, terrible purpose. The process began with a series of shallow, precise incisions across the hero's chest and arms, the scalpel's hand moving with an economy of motion that was both clinical and cruel. The initial cuts were like the strokes of a painter sketching the outline of a brutal portrait. Blood welled in thin, perfect lines, tracing the contours of his musculature. The Red Fox's jaw tightened, a sharp hiss escaping his clenched teeth, but his gaze never wavered. The crowd, larger than it had been for any previous execution, watched in a silence that was part horror, part morbid reverence. They were not just witnessing a punishment, were watching the systematic dismantling of their own hope. The scalpel worked with methodical patience, his focus absolute. He selected a narrower blade, its edge so fine it seemed to vanish in the light. With it, he began to lift and remove small, coin-sized pieces of flesh from the hero's shoulders and thighs, placing each one neatly in a waiting bronze bowl. The pain was no longer a series of stings, but a rising, crescendoing fire. Each new excision, a fresh wave of agony that built upon the last. The Red Fox's breath came in ragged gasps now, its body straining against the ropes that held him, sweat mingling with the blood that now ran in rivulets down his torso. Yet he refused to scream, his silence a final, powerful act of defiance. As the morning wore on, the scalpel moved to more substantial work, his tools growing larger, his actions more invasive. He used a small, sharp hook to peel back flaps of skin, exposing the glistening red muscle and white sinew beneath. The square was filled with the soft, wet sounds of his work, a grotesque symphony that played against the backdrop of the hero's increasingly labored breathing. The defiant light in the Red Fox's eyes began to flicker, not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming biological shock being inflicted upon his body. His world narrowed to the universe of the blade, to the escalating, unimaginable pain that was systematically divorcing his spirit from his flesh. The lesson was in the prolonged, intimate nature of the destruction. This was not a wild animal being put down. It was a complex mechanism being taken apart, its pieces catalogued and displayed. The emperor, watching from his shaded pavilion, saw not a man, but a concept being deconstructed. The legend of the Red Fox was being translated into a language of meat and suffering, its power dissolved in a bronze bowl filled with bloody tokens. When the final, merciful cut stilled the hero's heart long after his spirit had been broken, what remained on the frame was not a symbol of resistance, but a testament to the emperor's ultimate power, the ability to reduce even the greatest of heroes to a silent, bloody ruin. The legend was over, replaced by a memory of slow, surgical annihilation. The Emperor's creativity in the art of agony knew no natural bounds, seeking inspiration not only in forged metal and honed steel, but in the very forces of life itself. In the fertile, rain-soaked earth of the palace gardens, a new kind of terror was cultivated, one that used nature's relentless, silent growth as its instrument of execution. It was a punishment designed to be agonizingly slow, a marriage of patient horticulture and excruciating death, where the victim's own body became the soil for a fatal harvest. The chosen site was a secluded, muddy patch where a particular species of bamboo, known for its savage growth rate, thrived. Fresh, sharp shoots, like green daggers, had been specially nurtured and were now poised to spear upward with explosive energy. Over this living bed of potential spears, a farmer from a rebellious northern province was staked out. His crime was withholding his grain from the imperial tax collectors, a small act of defiance that demanded a large, symbolic end. He was forced onto his back, his wrists and ankles tied to stout pegs driven deep into the soft earth, his body stretched taut and immobile over the nascent bamboo forest. The damp smell of rich soil and vegetation filled the air, a deceptively peaceful scent that masked the horror to come. For the first hours, it was a torture of anticipation. The man could feel the hard, pointed tips of the shoots pressing against his back through his thin tunic, a constant, unsettling reminder of what was buried beneath him. He could do nothing but stare at the gray sky, listening to the distant sounds of the palace and the occasional drip of moisture from the leaves above. The guards assigned to watch him stood at a distance, their expressions bored as if waiting for a pot to boil. The true executioner was not a man with a blade, but the sun and the rain and the inexorable push of life from below. The change began not with a sudden violence, but with a gradual, creeping pressure. The bamboo, fueled by the warm, wet earth, began its daily surge of growth, sometimes as much as a full foot in a single day. The first sensation was a dull, insistent ache in the small of his back, as if a stone were being pressed deeper and deeper into his spine. Then came a sharp, piercing sting as the first needle-like tip, driven by immense natural force, finally pierced the worn fabric of his tunic and broke the skin. It was not a quick stab, but a slow, grinding intrusion. The plant fiber pushing its way through flesh with a steady, unstoppable pressure. The man's breath hitched, a low moan escaping his lips as the reality of his situation transformed from dread to active, penetrating agony. Another shoot found its mark, then another, each one a separate point of fire blossoming in his back. There was no impact, only invasion, a silent biological violation that his body was powerless to stop. He arched against his bonds, a futile attempt to escape the slow impalement. But the ropes held him fast, ensuring every millimeter of the bamboo's growth was translated directly into his suffering. Over the course of the day, the green spears continued their upward journey, tunneling through muscle and tissue, seeking the warmth at his core. The pain became a symphony of internal tearing, a deep, grinding anguish that eclipsed any wound made by man. His screams were not the short, sharp cries of a lashing, but long, drawn-out wails of utter helplessness, the sound of a man feeling himself being gradually skewered by the earth itself. Blood began to seep from the entry points, darkening the green shoots in the soil below, a slow and gruesome fertilization. The Emperor, when he came to observe, did so with a botanist's interest, noting the rate of growth and the victim's corresponding reactions with detached curiosity. This was the perfect punishment for a man who had hidden his harvest in the earth. The earth itself was now claiming its price. By nightfall, the bamboo had grown through him entirely, several shoots emerging from his abdomen and chest, their green tips now glistening red in the torchlight. The man's struggles had ceased, his body finally succumbing to the massive internal trauma, becoming a permanent, grotesque part of the garden. Human trellis from which the Emperor's most terrible plants would now grow, fed by the blood and bone of defiance. The screams of the dying had become the Emperor's symphony, the scent of blood and seared flesh his preferred incense. Yet as the months of his absolute rule stretched on, a subtle but dangerous ennui began to creep into the imperial soul. The established methods of punishments of flaying, the boiling, the dismemberment, had become routine. Their psychological impact on the populace, now predictable, their effect on the emperor himself diminished through repetition. The terror they inspired was a well-tuned instrument, but the musician was growing bored of the same notes. A new, more creative darkness was required to stir his jaded passions, to transform the administration of justice from a grim duty into a personal, rejuvenating entertainment. He began to spend hours in secluded chambers with his most trusted and morbidly inventive advisors, not reviewing scrolls of law or military dispatches, but sketching designs for new devices and conceptualizing novel forms of agony. The palace workshops, once dedicated to crafting fine furniture and ceremonial armor, now echoed with the sinister sounds of blacksmiths forging peculiar iron contraptions, and carpenters constructing frames of unsettling design. The emperor was no longer merely a ruler dispensing punishment. He was an artist, and the canvas was human suffering. The paints were fear and pain. His first new creation was unveiled in the throne room before a select audience of courtiers whose own survival depended on their ability to mirror the emperor's shifting moods. The device was a complex network of ropes and pulleys attached to a central frame, seemingly innocuous until its purpose was revealed. The victim, a captured spy who had failed in his mission, was secured within it. At the emperor's nod, executioners began turning cranks. The ropes tightened with a sinister creak, not to stretch the man apart but to bend him. Slowly, inexorably, his limbs were twisted into impossible, agonizing angles, joints popping and tendons screaming in protest. The emperor watched, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes alight with a renewed interest as he observed the precise mechanics of dislocation and the unique choked cries this method produced. He made mental notes, already considering refinements for the next performance. The following week, he introduced a method involving a series of progressively finer needles, each heated in a brazier until they glowed. A poet who had written verses lamenting the empire's sorrow was brought forth. The emperor himself descended from the dais to direct the procedure, pointing to specific nerve clusters on the man's body. The needles were inserted with meticulous care, not to cause massive damage, but to send targeted lightning bolts of pure, incandescent pain shooting through the poet's system. Each insertion was met with a sharp, breathy shriek, a different pitch of agony that the emperor seemed to catalog like a connoisseur sampling rare vintages. The goal was not death, but the exploration of pain's spectrum, the mapping of its nuances on a living subject. Prisoners from the overflowing dungeons became his test subjects, a living repository of raw materials for his cruel innovations. A new contraption might be tried on a petty thief one day, its flaws noted and corrected for use on a more significant political prisoner the next. The emperor's pleasure was found in the perfect functioning of his designs, in the specific quality of a scream, in the way a body reacted to a previously untried form of torment. The court watched these intimate, experimental sessions in terrified silence, their applause a mandatory hollow sound that followed each successful demonstration. They understood that they were witnessing a dangerous evolution. The emperor was no longer just punishing crime. He was indulging a hobby, and his hobby required a constant supply of fresh screams and breaking bodies. The state's machinery of fear had become the emperor's personal theater of pain, and he was its sole, enthralled audience, its director, and its most demanding critic. The simmering resentment that had long festered in the villages finally boiled over in the dusty market square of a small farming town. The emperor's tax collectors, relentless and pitiless, had taken not only the grain but the seed for the next planting, leaving behind a hollow certainty of famine. A group of peasants, their faces gaunt with hunger and hardened by despair, gathered not as a mob, but as a solemn, desperate congregation. Their leader was a broad-shouldered farmer named Kong, a man whose strength had once turned the soil, and whose voice now carried the collective fury of his people. He stood upon an overturned cart, not shouting, but speaking with a low, resonant intensity that drew the crowd tighter, their muttered agreements forming a chorus of shared anguish. They did not call for rebellion, but for reason, for the simple right to keep enough of their harvest to feed their children. Their protest was a raw, unpolished thing, born of the visceral understanding that death by starvation was as certain as death by the emperor's justice. At least one promised a quicker end. They waved no weapons, only their calloused, empty hands, their numbers their only shield against the inevitability of imperial retribution. For a few fleeting moments, in the heat of their shared desperation, they felt a fragile power, a unity that seemed to push back the shadow of the throne. The shadow, however, was always watching. The local magistrate, a petty tyrant whose authority was a pale reflection of the emperor's own, had sent riders at the first sign of unrest. The arrival of the imperial guard was not a charge, but a slow, deliberate encirclement, a noose of polished armor and drawn steel tightening around the gathered peasants. The fragile sense of power evaporated, replaced by the cold, familiar grip of terror. The guards did not engage the crowd. They ignored them, their focus solely on the man on the cart. They moved through the press of bodies with impersonal force, their gauntlet hands closing on Kong, dragging him down from his makeshift podium. He did not resist. The fight had gone out of him the moment the emperor's colors appeared, replaced by a grim acceptance. He was their voice, and now he would be their lesson. He was hauled to the center of the square, where a thick, weathered post, stained dark by sun and rain, things far worse, stood as a permanent fixture of imperial authority. His hands were wrenched behind him and bound tightly to the post with coarse, unforgiving rope, the fibers biting into his wrists. His tunic was torn away, baring his back to the crowd and the cloudless, pitiless sky. The sun beat down on his skin, highlighting the powerful muscles earned from a lifetime of labor. Muscles that would now serve only to tense against the agony to come. The executioner stepped forward, uncoiling the dreaded whip. This was not the multi-tailed lash of the scholar's flogging, but a single, heavy tail of braided leather. It's designed not to lacerate but to bludgeon, to break the spirit along with the skin. The crowd, held in place by a ring of spear points, watched in a silence thick enough to taste. This was a different kind of spectacle from the elaborate tortures of the capital. This was raw, provincial, and brutally efficient. The magistrate gave a curt nod, his face a mask of smug vindication. The first crack of the whip was a sound that shattered the tense quiet. A dry, thunderous report that echoed off the surrounding clay-brick buildings, landed across Kong's shoulders with a force that jerked his entire body forward against his bonds. A thick red wheal immediately rose on his sun-browned skin. He grunted, a sharp, explosive exhalation of shock and pain, but his head remained high. The second strike fell lower across the small of his back, and this time a stifled cry was torn from his throat. The executioner settled into a rhythm, his arm rising and falling with the practiced ease of a thresher swinging his flail. Each impact was a brutal, concussive blow, each one landing before the echo of the last had faded. Kang's body began to shudder with the effort of absorbing the punishment. His knuckles were white where they gripped the post behind him, his teeth gritted so hard they threatened to crack. The initial sharp pains began to merge into a deep, throbbing fire that spread across his entire back, a crescendo of agony building with every measured stroke. He tried to focus on the faces in the crowd, on the men and women he had tried to lead, but his vision began to blur at the edges of the world. Narrowing to the feel of the rope on his wrists, the rough wood of the post against his chest, and the world-ending impact that came again and again. The lesson had begun, written not on parchment, but on the living flesh of a farmer. Each lash a character in a story of absolute, unchallengeable power. The whip did not tire. It rose and fell with the grim, unchanging rhythm of a death knell, each crack a punctuation mark in the brutal sentence being written upon Kang's back. The initial sharp, distinct impacts had long since blurred into a single, continuous wave of agony, a fire that consumed his entire being. The skin, once tough and leathery from years working under the sun, now split under the relentless assault. Thin red lines at first, then wider tears, until his back was a grotesque mosaic of shredded flesh and welling blood. Each new lash landed on raw nerve endings, sending fresh, blinding jolts of pain arcing through his shuddering frame. His body was a testament to endurance, but every man has his breaking point. The proud set of his shoulders slumped, his head drooping forward, chin resting against his heaving chest. The grunts and stifled cries of the early strokes had given way too deep. Ragged sobs that racked his entire body, each one a fresh torment against the torn muscles of his back. His vision swam, the faces of the crowd dissolving into a shimmering, indistinct haze of color and pity. The world narrowed to the taste of blood in his mouth from a bitten lip, the coarse grain of the post against his forehead, and the ever-present, shattering anticipation of the next blow. The executioner was a study in impassive efficiency. His face, shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, showed no emotion, no pleasure, no fatigue. He was a machine of the state, his arm a piston driving imperial will into the body of a dissenter. The whip became an extension of that will, its leather tail now darkened and slick with Kang's blood, flicking droplets into the dusty air with every swing. The sound it made changed to. No longer a clean, dry crack, but a wet, heavy thud as it connected with the pulped meat of the farmer's back. The crowd watched, trapped in a prison of shared horror. Mothers clutched their children, pressing small faces into their skirts to block the sight, but they themselves could not look away, compelled by fear and a morbid, devastating empathy. Each strike made them flinch as one body, a silent, sympathetic echo of the punishment being meted out before them. The initial anger that had brought them to the square had been utterly extinguished, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread that settled deep in their bones. This was the true purpose of the spectacle, to burn away any spark of collective defiance and leave only the ashes of individual terror. Finally, after an eternity measured in lashes, the magistrate raised a hand. The executioner's arm froze in midair, the bloody whip hanging limp. The sudden silence was more shocking than the noise had been, a void filled only by Kang's wet, hitching breaths, and the buzz of flies already drawn to the scent of blood. The farmer hung limply from his bonds, held upright only by the ropes around his wrists. His back was no longer a part of a man but a ruined landscape of crimson and raw tissue, a horrifying testament to the cost of a few brave words. The magistrate barked a short order. The guards cut Kang down, his body collapsing into the dust like a sack of grain, unconscious or beyond caring. They did not bother to tend to him. His purpose as an example was complete. Whether he lived or died was irrelevant to the lesson. The ring of spears around the square parted, and the crowd was dismissed with a sharp gesture. They did not need to be told twice. They scattered not, speaking not, looking at one another, each person fleeing to the solitude of their own home, carrying with them the indelible image of Kang's shattered back in the absolute terrifying silence that had followed the last lash. The square was left empty, save for the flies in the dark, spreading stain in the dirt, a quiet and brutal confirmation that the emperor's reach was long, his arm was strong, and his justice was written in blood and scars. The emperor's pursuit of novel agonies had led his artisans to the forges, where fire and metal were bent to his cruelest whims. The result was a creation of sinister artistry, a life-size statue of a powerful bull, cast in solid bronze. It was a magnificent, terrifying object, its muscles rippling in captured motion, its head lowered as if to charge. But its beauty was a lie, a shell for a function so diabolical it stirred the emperor's jaded spirit like nothing had in months. This was no mere statue. It was an oven and an instrument of twisted theater, designed to transmute human suffering into animalistic music. Cunningly hinged and almost invisible along the bull's flank, was opened by the attending blacksmiths. The interior was a hollow, dark cavity, just large enough to hold a single man, curled in a fetal position. The chosen victim was a blacksmith himself, one of the very craftsmen who had labored on the project until a careless word of pity for its intended use had reached the emperor's ears. His punishment was to be the first audience for his own handiwork. He was forced inside the metallic tomb, his body crammed into the unyielding space, the cold bronze pressing against him on all sides. The door was sealed shut with a final, echoing clang, plunging him into absolute darkness and a silence broken only by the frantic hammering of his own heart. Outside, the emperor took a seat on a viewing platform, his courtiers arranged around him in a tense semicircle. At his signal, the blacksmiths stoked a great fire they had built beneath the bull's belly. The flames leaped hungrily, licking at the bronze. The transfer of heat was slow at first, then relentless. Inside his metal prison, the smith felt the change begin. The coolness of the cast metal gave way to a gentle warmth, then an uncomfortable heat, then a searing, unbearable intensity that built with every passing second. The air in the chamber grew thick and scorching, burning his lungs with each desperate gasp. The bronze itself began to conduct the fire's fury, glowing a faint, hellish red from the inside, cooking him alive within the statue's womb. His screams began as shouts of panic, then became raw, primal shrieks of agony as his skin blistered and stuck to the heating metal. But the true horror of the device was yet to be revealed. The emperor had specifically designed a network of narrow pipes and chambers that ran from the bull's interior to its flared nostrils and open mouth. These were not for air. They were an instrument. As the man's screams were forced from his searing lungs, they traveled through this convoluted system. The pipes, crafted by master musicians to alter sound, distorted his human cries, stretching and bending them into something else entirely, a deep, bellowing, bovine roar that erupted from the bull's head. The effect was surreal and chilling. The bull statue, heated to a dull glow by the inferno beneath it, appeared to come to life, bellowing in apparent fury or pain. Each gut-wrenching scream from the man trapped inside was converted into a monstrous, animalistic roar that echoed across the palace grounds. The courtiers watched, their faces pale, as the emperor leaned forward, a spark of genuine, unholy fascination in his eyes. He was not listening to a man dying. He was appreciating the acoustics of his design, the perfect translation of human torment into a beast's cry. Inside, the smith's world was a universe of blistering heat and unimaginable pain. His own voice transformed and projected back at him as a grotesque parody of his suffering. The roaring in his ears was his own death song, played back on a bronze instrument. His thrashing within the confined space only served to press more of his body against the scalding metal, accelerating his end. Eventually, his screams weakened, then ceased, his body succumbing to the heat. The bull's roars faded into a final low, guttural moan that hung in the air before fading into silence, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the faint, sickening smell of cooked meat that seeped from the statue's seams. The emperor nodded, satisfied. It had performed exactly as designed. He ordered the fire extinguished. As the bronze cooled, the bull stood silent once more, a beautiful, terrible monument to his inventive cruelty, its hollow belly now holding a crisped and blackened secret. It was more than a punishment. It was the emperor's finest concert, and the dying screams of a man had been his orchestra. The emperor's imagination, once satisfied by the swift and the spectacular, now turned toward a more patient, insidious form of punishment, one that weaponized time itself. He conceived of a method that required no blades, no fire, no complex machinery, only the unrelenting elements and the slow, inexorable failure of the human body. It was a sentence not of moments, but of days, a public unraveling of life at its most fundamental level. This would be the lingering death, a testament to the fact that the emperor's power could be as patient and inevitable as the turning of the earth. In the vast, dusty expanse of the main execution square, a new structure was erected. It was not a frame or a cage, but a simple, raised wooden platform. At each of its four corners, a thick post was sunk deep into the planks. Its purpose was immediately horrifyingly clear. The victims, 3 scribes accused of altering a minor tax record to ease the burden on their village, were brought forth. They were not bound for a beating or a burning, but were instead secured to the posts in a standing position. Their wrists and ankles tied with rough hemp that allowed for little movement, but promised no quick release. They were positioned to face the 4 cardinal directions, ensuring that no matter where one stood in the square, a dying man would be in view. The sentence was simple. They were to be left there, exposed to the sky, denied all food and water until their bodies consumed themselves from within. The emperor's decree was read aloud, proclaiming that their crime of betrayal of imperial accuracy warranted a death that mirrored the slow, eroding effect of a lie upon the truth. The punishment began not with a violent act, but with a withdrawal. The guards who usually stood as menacing sentinels during executions now formed a wide, impassable cordon around the square's perimeter. Their role shifted from active tormentors to passive enforcers of this slow-motion death sentence. The first day passed under a blistering sun. The initial fear of the 3 men gave way to a stubborn defiance, then to a growing, gnawing thirst as the heat baked the moisture from their bodies. Their lips cracked and swelled. They watched the comings and goings of the city from their fixed positions, a cruel panorama of normal life continuing just beyond their reach. The crowd, compelled to traverse the square on their daily business, cast furtive, horrified glances at the living statues on the platform. There was no spectacle to see, only the dreadful anticipation of what was to come, a psychological torture for the witnesses as much as a physical one for the condemned. By the second day, the defiance had evaporated, replaced by a desperate agony. Their pleas for water became hoarse, rasping sounds that carried across the silent square, more painful to hear than any scream of acute pain. Their skin, red and inflamed from sunburn, grew tight and dry. The guards remained unmoved, their faces stony. The emperor, from his shaded balcony, observed the progress with clinical interest, noting the changes in their posture, the weakening of their cries. This was the true artistry of the method. The transformation was internal, a quiet cellular collapse happening in full view. On the third day, delirium set in. One of the scribes began laughing at nothing, his cracked lips splitting further with the effort. Another mumbled incoherently to long-dead ancestors, his head lolling against the post that held him upright. The third had fallen silent, his eyes open but unseeing, fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. The stench of urine and the slow creep of dysentery began to rise from the platform, adding a foulness to the atmosphere of slow decay. Flies gathered, drawn to the moisture at their eyes and mouths, a buzzing, crawling prelude to the carrion eaters that would eventually follow. The fourth day was a study in utter collapse. Their bodies, deprived of all sustenance, had begun to consume their own muscle. Their forms, once robust, appeared shrunken, their cheekbones stark against parchment-dry skin. Their breathing was a shallow, rattling effort. The square, usually a place of hushed dread during executions, was now filled with a different, more profound horror, the silent, collective witnessing of life simply ebbing away, drop by agonizing drop. There was no grand finale, no final cry. One by one, over the course of the fifth day, they simply stopped. Their heads slumped forward, their shallow breathing ceased. They died not with a bang, but a whimper, their bodies finally yielding to the emperor's most patient and cruel invention. They were left on the platform for another full day, 3 sun-blackened husks, a silent, enduring lesson that under the new order, even time itself could be harnessed as an instrument of death. The river's current, usually a life-giving artery for the empire, was today an instrument of a slow, silent execution. On its bank, a large, cube-shaped cage of thick iron bars sat waiting, its interior already packed with a dozen prisoners peasants from a valley that had dared protest a new labor decree. Their crime was collective obstinacy, and their punishment would be a collective, suffocating end, a spectacle of desperate struggle played out behind bars for the emperor and his court to observe from a silk-draped barge anchored midstream. The cage was winched into the air by a creaking wooden crane, swinging slightly over the water's dark, placid surface. The prisoners within clung to the bars, their faces pale masks of terror, their knuckles white. They knew what was coming. There were no cries for mercy. Those had been exhausted days ago in the dungeons. Now, there was only the silent, gut-churning anticipation of the plunge. The emperor, seated comfortably on the barge, gave a languid wave of his hand. The mechanism released. The cage dropped with a great splash, vanishing beneath the brown water for a moment before bobbing back to the surface, now half submerged, the river pouring through the gaps in the bars. The prisoners scrambled, pushing and climbing over one another in a frantic, silent ballet for the shrinking pocket of air at the top of the cage. Their mouths were open in soundless screams, the panic so absolute it stole their breath before the water could. The crane operator, following his orders with mechanical precision, began to lower the cage again, more slowly this time. It sank inch by inexorable inch, the water rising around the trapped men and women. The air pocket compressed. Those on the bottom were already fully submerged, their hands slapping against the bars from below, their movements becoming wild, uncontrolled, thrashing as the primal instinct to breathe overrode all else. Bubbles, large and frantic, erupted around them as they expelled the last of their air. From the barge, the view was perfectly clear through the surprisingly transparent water. The emperor and his court watched the human drama unfold with detached fascination. It was like observing fish in a jar, but these fish were drowning, their faces contorted in the silent agony of asphyxiation. Bodies pressed against the iron lattice, mouths desperately seeking a non-existent gap, eyes wide with the horrifying knowledge of their end. The struggle was a grotesque, slow-motion dance of death, each second stretching into an eternity of torment. The cage settled on the riverbed, now completely filled with water and struggling humanity. The thrashing became more subdued, a series of weak, convulsive movements as oxygen deprivation set in. One by one the prisoners stilled, their forms becoming limp and drifting slightly in the current within their metallic tomb. The last to go was a young man who had managed to keep his nose and mouth in the final, kind-sized bubble of air at the very top of the cage. His was the most prolonged agony, his head tilted back at an impossible angle, his body submerged while he took his last desperate gasps from that tiny, vanishing pocket. Finally, with a final surrendering exhalation, a stream of small, perfect bubbles rose from his lips, journeying slowly up through the water to break upon the surface in a soft, almost polite plop. The river flowed on, indifferent. The cage, now a sunken grave, sat silently on the muddy bottom, its occupant still. The only sign of the horror that had just transpired was that last, lingering bubble that had popped on the surface, a fleeting, insignificant punctuation mark at the end of a dozen lives. The Emperor nodded, seemingly satisfied with the efficiency and clarity of the demonstration. He signaled for the barge to return to shore, leaving the cage and its contents for the current to clean and the river creatures to claim. The lesson was delivered without a single shouted order or scream heard above water, quiet, efficient, and utterly terrifying drowning of hope itself. The artist's crime was one of pigment and line. A transgression committed not with a weapon or a whispered plot, but with a brush and a pot of vermilion ink. He had dared to caricature the Emperor, to capture not the divine ruler, but the paranoid tyrant, exaggerating the cruel twist of the mouth and the cold reptilian stare. The drawing, crude and powerful, had been passed from hand to hand in the city's tea-houses, a spark of silent laughter in a world gone gray with fear. When the secret police finally traced it back to his cramped studio, his fate was sealed. His art had mocked the throne. Now his very skin would become a canvas for the Emperor's reply. He was dragged to the execution square not as a common criminal, but as a special guest of the imperial wrath. A new frame awaited him, one that tilted backward, presenting his body to the sky like an offering. The executioner for this task was not the hulking brute of the whip or the clinical scalpel of the linky, but a thin, precise man with the delicate hands of a scribe. His tools were different, a collection of knives with blades so thin and flexible they seemed to shimmer like water, and hooks finer than a lady's hairpin. This was not to be a dismemberment or a bludgeoning, but a meticulous unveiling. The process began with a single, impossibly sharp incision at the base of the artist's throat, a line so fine it barely bled. The artist, who had used lines to convey meaning, now felt a line that conveyed pure, undiluted terror. The executioner's hands moved with a surreal gentleness. His touch feathered light as he worked the tip of the blade beneath the skin of the chest, separating the dermis from the muscle beneath with a series of tiny, precise cuts. It was a perverse inversion of the artistic process, not adding layer upon layer of paint, but removing the foundational layer of the self. The pain was a unique and horrifying symphony. It was not the deep, crushing agony of the whip or the burning fire of the iron chair, but a sharp, screaming hypersensitivity. Every millimeter of skin peeled back was a universe of exposed nerve endings, screaming into the void. The artist's breath came in short, frantic gasps, his eyes wide with a horror that surpassed anything his own imagination had ever conceived. He was being unmade, his outer self slowly divorced from the inner, a living anatomy lesson in the most brutal sense. The executioner worked with the focused concentration of a man restoring a priceless manuscript, his every movement deliberate, careful not to tear the precious material he was harvesting. As the work progressed, the artist's chest and abdomen were laid bare, the skin peeled down and held aside by the fine hooks, revealing the glistening red tapestry of muscle and sinew beneath. Screams had long since faded into a continuous low moan, a sound of such profound existential agony that it seemed to chill the very air. The crowd, accustomed to bloodshed, watched this new, intimate violation in a silence of unparalleled dread. This was not a punishment of strength being broken, but of identity being flayed away. When the task was finally complete, the artist's body was a raw, shuddering ruin. But his masterpiece, the single, large, intact sheet of his own skin, was treated with reverence. It was washed, stretched taut on a special frame, and treated with salts to preserve it. The Emperor himself descended to inspect the work, his eyes tracing the patterns of the man's tattoos and birthmarks now rendered meaningless on the bloody pelt. He ordered it displayed in the grand hall, not as a warning, but as a new work of art. It hung between tapestries of silk and gold, a grotesque exhibit in the emperor's collection. The lesson was clear. All art belonged to the throne. It could be created by the hand of a subject, but it would only be displayed once it had been written on the skin of its maker. The artist's final, terrible masterpiece was not a drawing of the emperor, but a living portrait of the emperor's power. Painted in the medium of his own flayed flesh, the emperor's search for a punishment that married visceral horror with psychological dread had scoured the natural world, and in the squirming, frantic form of the common rat, he found a perfect instrument of terror. It was a creature of filth and desperation, driven by base instincts. And he would weaponize those instincts in a manner so intimate and violating it would eclipse even the most elaborate metal contraptions. The design was deceptively simple, its cruelty lying not in complex mechanics, but in the raw biological panic it would invoke. The victim was a stable master accused of poisoning the emperor's favorite stallion, a crime of petty vengeance that demanded a proportionally grotesque response. He was forced onto his back upon a stone slab in the palace's lower courtyard, a place where the scent of hay and horse still lingered, a cruel reminder of the life he was losing. His wrists and ankles were cinched tight with leather straps, rendering him utterly immobile, a living altar for a new kind of sacrifice. He stared at the sky, his breath coming in short, terrified hitches, every sense heightened by the unknown nature of what was to come. The emperor's torturers approached not with blades or brands, but with a heavy, wide-based terracotta pot. Its mouth was lashed shut with a stretched piece of thick parchment, and from within came a frantic skittering, scratching sound, the noise of multiple panicked creatures trapped together. The stable master's eyes widened as the pot was placed upside down, squarely on his bare abdomen, its wide rim pressing into his flesh. The weight was significant, the clay cooled against his skin, but it was the movement inside that sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He could feel the scrabbling of tiny clawed feet against the inner surface of the pot. A frantic vibration transmitted directly into his stomach. Then came the heat. A guard approached with a brazier, its coals glowing a fierce orange, did not bring it near the victim's skin directly. Instead, he held it close to the upturned bottom of the pot, moving it in slow, deliberate circles. The terracotta began to absorb the heat, conducting it inward, transforming the pot from a simple prison into an oven. The skittering inside intensified, becoming a frenzied cacophony of scratching and high-pitched squeaks. The rats, trapped and increasingly desperate, were being baked alive. For the stable master, the experience was a unique and escalating hell. The initial coolness of the clay gave way to an uncomfortable warmth, then a distinct growing heat that seeped into his skin. But the true horror was the vibration, the palpable sense of the creature's rising panic, just a thin layer of pottery away from his own vulnerable flesh. His mind, starved for information, conjured images of their sharp teeth and wild eyes, their instinct to survive now directly opposed to his own. He strained against his bonds, a futile effort that only served to emphasize his helplessness. The emperor, watching from a shaded archway, observed the man's trembling and the slow heating of the pot with a calm, analytical eye. This was the prelude, the tightening of the strings before the symphony of agony began. The stage was set, the players man and rat were in place, and the only thing left was to turn up the heat. The heat became a living thing, a penetrating force that seeped through the terracotta and into the stable master's abdomen, a dull, burning ache that grew with every passing second. But the true horror was the vibration from within the pot, which had escalated from a frantic skittering to a violent, desperate scrabbling. The rats, driven to a frenzy by the intensifying heat that cooked the air in their ceramic prison, were no longer merely panicked. They were engaged in a savage battle for survival, and their instincts had identified the only possible escape route: down. The first sensation was not pain, but pressure, a sudden, focused pushing against the parchment stretched across the pot's mouth. The stable master's eyes, already wide with terror, bulged as he felt the center of the pot bow slightly inward against his skin. Then came the sound of tearing, a small, wet rip as determined teeth and claws finally breached the parchment barrier. The heat and the promise of cooler air beyond had directed their fury with a single-minded purpose. The first puncture into his flesh was not a clean cut, but a ragged, grinding intrusion. A rat, its fur singed and its eyes wild with primal fear, had begun to burrow. It was not an act of malice, but of blind, biological imperative. The stablemaster's scream was a high, shrill sound of pure, unadulterated violation. A noise that had less to do with physical pain and more to do with the horrific intimacy of the invasion. He could feel the creature's frantic movements, the scrabbling of its claws against his inner tissues, the gnawing and tearing as it tunneled deeper, seeking refuge from the heat in the only soft, cool darkness it could find. His abdominal cavity. Then another breach came, and another. Other rats, following the first, poured their frantic energy into the same desperate task. The initial sharp tearing pains dissolved into a deep internal agony of a kind he could never have imagined. It was a feeling of being devoured from the inside, a squirming, churning horror as the creatures writhed and burrowed within him. His screams became continuous, breathless wails, his body arching against the straps in uncontrollable spasms as his nervous system was overwhelmed by signals of catastrophic internal damage. He could feel them moving inside him, their small bodies displacing his organs, their sharp teeth nipping at anything in their path. The pain was a universe of sharp, grinding torment and deep, sickening pressure, a violation so complete it shattered his mind. His vision swam with red and black spots, the physical world receding behind the overwhelming reality of the internal nightmare. The smell of his own blood and perforated bowel began to mix with the scent of heated clay and the musky odor of the rats. The Emperor watched, his expression one of intense, fascinated concentration. This was the crescendo he had envisioned. The external application of heat had yielded an internal, self-propelled torture of breathtaking efficiency and horror. The rats were the perfect executioners in thinking, relentless, and utterly terrifying. The stablemaster's thrashing grew weaker as shock and massive internal trauma set in. His screams faded to wet, gurgling rasps, blood trickling from the corners of his mouth. The movements within his abdomen grew more frantic for a moment, as the rats fought in their new fleshy environment, then gradually stilled as they too succumbed to the heat and the lack of air entombed within the very refuge they had sought. Finally, the stablemaster fell still, his eyes glassy and fixed on the sky he could no longer see. The only sound was the faint crackle of the brazier and the slow drip of blood onto the stone slab. The Emperor gave a slow, satisfied nod. The experiment had been a perfect success. He turned and walked away, leaving behind the pot, the body, and the ghastly, squirming secret within, a testament to a cruelty that could harness nature's most base instincts to orchestrate a death of unparalleled horror. The Emperor's latest design arrived from the forges not with the roar of fire or the scream of tortured metal, but in a grim, silent procession. It was a coffin-shaped cabinet, taller than a man, forged from plates of dark, unpolished iron. Its front was a single hinged door, and its surface was studded with row upon row of inward-pointing spikes, each one filed to a needle-sharp point. There were no decorative flourishes, no artistic pretensions, only a brutal geometric promise of impalement. This was the Iron Maiden, and its first occupant was to be a captured spy from a rival kingdom. A man whose loyalty to his own ruler was about to be tested against the Emperor's newest invention. The spy was a lean, hardened man, his face a mask of stoic resignation. He had been broken by weeks in the dungeons, his secrets already spilled, his body bearing the marks of less imaginative interrogations. His value now was purely functional. He was the living test for a prototype. He was dragged before the device, and the heavy door was swung open, revealing the forest of spikes within, their points gleaming dully in the torchlight. The interior was a space just wide enough to contain a man, but only if he remained perfectly, impossibly still. He was forced inside, the cold iron pressing against his back and chest simultaneously. The spikes did not pierce him yet. They merely kissed his skin at a dozen points, a cold, threatening promise of what would come with movement. The door was left slightly ajar, not yet sealed. The Emperor himself descended from his dais, circling the device with the critical eye of a master craftsman inspecting his work. He nudged the door with his finger, and it swung an inch, enough for a spike on the interior to graze the spy's arm, drawing a thin line of blood. The Emperor's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. The mechanism was perfectly calibrated. With a nod from the throne, the executioners stepped forward. They did not slam the door shut, but began to close it with a slow, relentless pressure. The spy, understanding his role in this final terrible performance, braced himself. The first contact was a series of sharp, simultaneous pricks as the points found their marks. Then the pressure increased. The spikes were not designed to kill instantly, but to penetrate slowly, to maximize the duration of agony and the psychological terror of feeling one's own body being incrementally violated. A low groan escaped the spy's lips as the point sank deeper into his shoulders, his thighs, his abdomen. The Emperor watched, utterly absorbed. This was the essence of his design, the slow, inevitable progression, the transformation of a living man into a pincushion of his own making. The spy's body was pinned in place by the advancing points, his struggles only serving to drive them deeper. Blood began to well around the bases of the spikes, tracing dark paths down the iron interior. His breathing became ragged, each inhalation a careful, painful effort to avoid driving the spikes in his chest deeper into his lungs. The door closed with a final soft click, the sound of a lock engaging. The spy was now fully encased, a man fused with a machine of pain. His muffled cries could be heard from within, a wet, choked sound. The Emperor stepped closer, placing his ear near the door, listening to the awful symphony of metal meeting flesh and bone. After a long moment, he stepped back, a look of profound approval on his face. He personally took a hammer and a chisel and etched a small, intricate dragon into the iron of the door, his personal seal of approval on the design. The Iron Maiden was not just effective, it was art. It was left standing in the center of the hall, a silent, spike-studded tomb, until the last faint sound from within ceased, leaving only the metallic scent of blood and the Emperor's complete satisfaction. The Emperor's justice had employed fire, blade, and beast, but for the leader of a burgeoning rebellion in the southern provinces, a punishment of pure brute force was deemed most fitting. The man was a mountain of a former blacksmith, his arms thick with the muscle of his trade, and his spirit hardened in the fires of dissent. He had rallied hundreds to his cause, not with subtle plots but with roaring speeches about the weight of imperial oppression. His end would therefore be a spectacle of raw physical power, a demonstration that the Empire's strength could shatter even the strongest of its enemies. The method was ancient, brutal, and terrifying in its simplicity. He would be pulled apart. The chosen venue was the widest of the imperial parade grounds, its packed turf surface scarred from the passage of chariots and marching feet. At its center, a heavy iron ring had been hammered deep into the ground. The rebel leader was brought forth, not broken or pleading, but with his head held high, his defiance a final act of rebellion in itself. He was stripped to a loincloth, his powerful physique a testament to the very strength the Emperor sought to destroy. His wrists and ankles were bound with thick, oiled leather straps, each connected to a long, heavy chain. The other ends of the 4 chains were fastened to the harnesses of 4 massive imperial war horses. Beasts bred for size and power, their coats glistening like polished chestnuts in the sun. They stood patiently, their hooves stamping the dust, their breath pluming in the cool morning air. They were instruments, unaware of the grim purpose they served. A teamsman stood at the head of each horse, his hand on the bridle, awaiting the signal. The Emperor's herald stepped forward, his voice booming across the silent, packed field. The entire population of the surrounding districts had been compelled to attend, a sea of faces pressed against the wooden barriers erected by the guards. They stood in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight, their collective breath held. The herald detailed the rebels' crimes, not just treason, but the sin of inspiring hope, of convincing others that the Emperor's strength could be challenged. His sentence was to be erased, not with a blade, but with the Empire's own untamable power. At a trumpet's blast, the teamsmen mounted their horses. The rebel leader was forced to the ground, his limbs stretched taut in a star pattern toward the 4 points of the compass, the chains pulling his joints to their limits. He lay there, exposed and vulnerable, the sky above him a vast, indifferent blue. The only sound was the jingle of harnesses and the nervous snort of a horse. The Emperor, seated on a raised platform, lifted his hand. He held it there for a long moment, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable pitch, letting every person in the crowd feel the impending horror in the pit of their stomach. Then he dropped it. The crack of 4 whips echoed as one. Teamsmen shouted, digging their heels into the flanks of the great beasts. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The horses strained against their burdens, their powerful muscles bunching, their iron-shod hooves digging for purchase in the earth. The chain snapped taut with a sound like a thunderclap. Then came the scream. It was a sound of such profound biological agony that it seemed to tear the very air. It was not a cry of fear or protest, but the raw, involuntary shriek of a body being systematically dismantled by forces far beyond its capacity to endure. The pressure was immense, a pulling apart that started at the joints. Shoulders and hips were the first to go, dislocating with wet popping sounds that were audible even at a distance. The rebel's body arched off the ground, a bowstring of torment stretched to its breaking point. The horses, urged on by their riders, leaned into their harnesses, their immense strength finally overcoming the tensile strength of muscle and sinew. The sound that followed was a sickening, wet rip, a tearing of things that were never meant to be separated. A limb was not cleanly removed. It was wrenched from its socket in an explosion of blood and torn tissue. One arm went first, then a leg, the chains whipping back with the sudden release of tension. The severed limbs landing with dull thuds on the churned earth. What remained of the man was a shuddering, bloody torso, still held by the 2 remaining chains. His screams had ceased, replaced by a horrible, guttural choking as shock and massive trauma overwhelmed his system. The horses, still pulling, completed their grim work. The final separation was the most gruesome, a rending of the trunk itself. Then there was silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the horses and the sound of something dripping onto the dust. Where one man had lain, there were now 5 pieces. The crowd stood frozen, many with their hands over their mouths, their faces pale. The compulsion to watch had become a sentence in itself, branding the horrific image onto their minds forever. The teamsmen dismounted, their task complete. The emperor rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping over the field and the silent, traumatized populace. He did not look at the remains. He looked at the people. The message was undeniable, written in blood and dismembered flesh. The empire's power was absolute, and it could and would tear apart anyone who dared to challenge it. The horses were led away, and the crowd was dismissed to carry the memory of the sound that single, unifying scream followed by the terrible wet silence back into the heart of the empire. The emperor's justice had always favored the permanent over the transient, the scar over the wound. Floggings healed, bones mended, and even the memory of the most elaborate tortures could fade with time into the realm of nightmare and hearsay. But the emperor desired a mark that would not fade, a stigma that would walk among his subjects long after the screams had died and the blood had been washed from the stones. He conceived of a punishment that was both spectacle and lasting sentence. A public branding that would transform a dissenter into a living monument to their own transgression. The chosen instrument was fire and iron, and the seal was his own. In the execution square, the braziers were stoked hotter than for any previous spectacle, the coals within glowing with a white-hot intensity that hurt the eyes. Between them stood an anvil, and upon it rested the branding iron. It was not a simple cattle brand, but a work of cruel artistry, a long metal rod culminating in an intricate, raised impression of the emperor's personal seal, the coiled dragon of absolute power. The iron itself was heating in the heart of the nearest brazier, its end gradually taking on the same hellish glow as the coals that nurtured it. The condemned were a group of scribes and minor officials accused of producing and distributing critical pamphlets. Their crime was one of words, of ideas. And their punishment would be to where the emperor's answer burned into their very flesh, a rebuttal in scar tissue. They were lined up, their hands bound, forced to watch as the first of them was dragged forward. A man named Wei, who had once penned elegant calligraphy, was forced to his knees before the anvil. His tunic was ripped open, bearing the skin of his right shoulder, the place where a brand would be most visible in life, and if they were ever granted the dignity of a burial, would remain to identify their treason for eternity. The master blacksmith, not an executioner, but a craftsman of metal, approached the brazier. Using long, heavy tongs, he lifted the branding iron from the fire. The metal glowed with a vicious orange-white light, the dragon seal at its tip shimmering with waves of heat. He carried it with solemn ceremony, the air around it wavering, the symbol of power now a physical embodiment of its wrath. The crowd, held back by guards, watched in a silence fraught with a new kind of dread. This was not a punishment that ended with death. It was a punishment that began with a moment of agony, and then persisted for a lifetime. Wei was held fast by 2 guards, his head wrenched to the side, so he could not see the approach of the iron, though he could feel its heat radiating toward his skin, a terrifying promise of what was to come. The blacksmith did not hurry. He positioned the glowing seal with the precision of a printer aligning his block, ensuring the mark would be perfect, legible, and deep. Then, with a firm, unwavering pressure, he pressed the searing metal into the flesh of Wei's shoulder. The sound was a violent, sizzling hiss, like meat dropped onto a scorching griddle, but infinitely louder in the tense silence of the square. It was accompanied by the nauseating, sweetly acrid smell of burning hair and cooking flesh. Wei's body convulsed against the hands that held him. A strangled scream ripped from his throat, a raw sound of pure, concentrated agony that was over almost as soon as it began. The iron was held in place for a count of 3, ensuring the burn would be deep enough to destroy the skin layers and prevent clean healing. When the iron was pulled away, it left behind a perfect, smoking impression of the Emperor's dragon. The skin within the raised lines of the seal was charred black, while the surrounding flesh was an angry, blistering red, already swelling with terrible inflammation. Wei slumped, unconscious from the shock, the brand on his shoulder a fresh, horrifying wound. But everyone present knew this wound was different. It would never truly heal. It would form a thick, ropey keloid, a permanent, ugly testament to his crime. He would carry it until his dying day, and every person who saw it would know him instantly as a traitor. Shunning him, fearing him, seeing not a man but the Emperor's mark, one by one, the others were brought forward. Sizzling impact, each choked cry, each new plume of sickening smoke drove the lesson deeper. This was not merely pain. The Emperor, from his viewing platform, watched the procession with cold approval. These branded men would now be released back into the populace, not as reclaimed citizens, but as walking warnings. They were living, breathing propaganda, their very bodies made into imperial billboards. Their suffering was not a moment, but a lifetime. They were the Emperor's message, written in fire and flesh, permanent reminder that dissent would not just be punished, it would be branded onto the soul of the Empire for all to see, forever. The deepest cells of the Imperial dungeon were not places of mere physical suffering, but realms of sensory deprivation so absolute they unraveled the mind itself. Here in the Empire's bowels, time lost all meaning, and reality frayed at the edges. The cells were hewn from the living rock, small, wet, and utterly lightless. The darkness was not an absence of light, but a tangible presence, a thick, suffocating velvet that pressed against the eyes and filled the lungs with the chill of eternal night. The only thing thicker than the dark was the silence of profound, ringing quiet so deep one could hear the frantic, muffled thumping of their own heart and the slow drip of condensation from the ceiling, each drop a tiny hammer blow on the anvil of sanity. But this silence was not pure. It was punctuated, at irregular intervals, by the sounds from elsewhere. These were not the ordinary noises of a prison, the clang of doors, the tread of guards, but the raw, unfiltered audio of agony. A scream, sharp and sudden, would slice through the blackness. Echoing down the stone corridors, its source and distance impossible to gauge. It would be followed by a wet, choking gurgle, then silence again, leaving the listener in the dark to imagine the scene that had produced it. Sometimes it was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of a saw on bone, a sound that seemed to go on for hours. Other times it was the low, agonized moaning of someone broken on the wheel, a continuous, hopeless sound that wormed its way into the brain. The prisoners in these lightless holes had no company but these disembodied torments. They would press their ears to the cold, slimy stone, trying to discern a pattern, a reason, any anchor in the sea of horrific noise. Was that the voice of the cellmate arrested with them? The cry of a loved one from another wing? The mind, starved for stimulus, would cling to these sounds, weaving elaborate, terrifying narratives around them. A simple groan became the death rattle of their entire family. A distant, frantic scrabbling became the rats consuming the man in the next cell. The line between what was heard and what was imagined blurred and then vanished entirely. The emperor understood that the most effective prison was not one made of bars, but one constructed within the human psyche. By isolating a man and feeding him only the sounds of others' suffering, he transformed the dungeon into a collaborative torture chamber where each victim's agony amplified the fear of all the others. A prisoner would lie curled on the damp stone, shivering not from the cold, but from the anticipation of the next scream, each one a fresh injection of terror into the void. They would beg for the silence to return, only to find its absolute purity more maddening than the screams themselves. The darkness became a screen upon which their worst fears were projected, their own imaginations becoming the most skilled and cruel torturers of all, fueled by the soundtrack of the emperors. Just as playing on an endless, horrifying loop in the eternal night, the emperor's final solution for the simmering unrest in the outer provinces was not a singular, spectacular execution, but a sprawling, public gallery of prolonged death. The main road to the capital, usually a vibrant artery of commerce and travel, was to be transformed into a grim avenue of imperial authority. Its borders marked not by mileposts, but by the crucified. Dozens of captives, village elders, outspoken farmers, and anyone suspected of harboring rebellious thoughts were to be made into permanent. Dying landmarks, their suffering a continuous sermon for every soul entering the city. The work began at dawn. Teams of soldiers, their faces grim and impersonal, erected heavy timber crosses at precise intervals along the road's edge. The sheer number of them was the first shock, a forest of impending death that stretched as far as the eye could see, diminishing into the morning haze. The condemned were brought forth in chains, a shuffling, hollow-eyed procession of the damned. There was no ceremony, no last words. Efficiency was the only ritual. One by one, they were thrown onto the rough-hewn beams. The sound of hammers striking iron nails was a brutal, rhythmic percussion that echoed across the flatlands, a terrible industry of agony. Each impact was a sharp, wet crack of bone and tendon giving way, followed by a scream that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the landscape. Bodies were wrenched and secured, their arms stretched taut, their weight immediately pulling against the cruel points of penetration. They were then hoisted upright, the crosses thudding into the pre-dug holes, where they were packed with earth and stone to stand firm against the struggles of the dying. Within an hour, the transformation was complete. The road to Sheanyang was now flanked by a silent, writhing forest of human suffering. The purpose was not a quick death, but a slow public unraveling. The position was meticulously designed to prolong agony for days. The weight of the body pulled down on the nailed wrists, constricting the chest and making each breath a shallow, desperate effort. The feet, often nailed or bound, offered no relief. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the exposed skin, while thirst became a torment worse than the wounds themselves. Flies, drawn by the scent of blood and sweat, swarmed the helpless figures, crawling over faces and into open mouths. Travelers on the road were forced to run this gauntlet of death. Merchants lowered the shades on their palanquins, unable to meet the accusatory or pleading stares of the dying. Farmers driving carts kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, their children's questions met with sharp, fearful silence. The air grew thick with the sounds of labored breathing, low moans, and the occasional heart-rending cry for water that would never come. The stench of sweat, blood, and the first hints of decay hung over the road like a foul miasma. As the days passed, the struggles weakened. Cries faded to ragged whispers, then to nothing at all. The bodies sagged against their bindings, their heads lolling. Crows gathered, perching on the horizontal beams with indifferent patience, waiting for their feast. The crucified became less like men and more like gruesome scarecrows, their features sunken and unrecognizable. Yet their eyes often remained open, glassy orbs that seemed to watch every passerby, imparting a silent, terrible lesson. The emperor would sometimes ride the length of the road in his chariot, not in triumph, but in quiet assessment. He saw not individuals in agony, but a perfectly implemented policy. The crucifixion parade was his most efficient creation yet. It required no guards, no daily rituals, no fuel or tools beyond the initial investment. It was a self-sustaining engine of terror, powered by the slow expiration of its victims, its message broadcast to every citizen and visitor. Descent leads here to this slow, lonely, and utterly public end on the road to the Emperor's glory. The crosses stood long after the last breath had been drawn, the bleached bones and tattered remnants of clothing serving as a permanent, chilling welcome to the capital. The Emperor's ingenuity had plumbed the depths of fire, blade, and beast. But his search for a punishment that embodied utter, final obliteration led him to the industrial heart of his empire, the mill. He commandeered the largest grain mill on the outskirts of the capital, a massive structure of timber and stone powered by a relentless water wheel, but its purpose was perverted from sustenance to annihilation. The great grinding stones, each the size of a chariot wheel, were no longer for crushing wheat into flour, but for reducing human defiance into a nameless, bloody paste. This was the fate reserved for those who, even under the most extreme duress, refused to betray the secrets they held, a punishment that promised not just death, but the total erasure of their physical form. The mill's interior was a cavernous space filled with the thunderous roar of the water wheel and the deep grinding rumble of the stones. The air was thick with a fine, choking dust that smelled of old grain and now of a new, metallic temps of fear. A wooden chute normally used to funnel grain had been repurposed. It led upwards to a platform where the condemned were brought, their eyes wide with a terror that surpassed the fear of mere dismemberment or fire. This was a fear of unbeing, of being unmade into something less than human. The first to be fed into the machine was a captured spy from the northern steppes, a man who had laughed in the face of the Iron Maiden and endured the rat torture without uttering a single word. His loyalty to his Khan was absolute, a fortress the Emperor's torturers had failed to breach. They would not need his secrets. They would simply need his body to teach a different lesson. He was dragged, struggling weakly, to the top of the chute, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight, fixed on the gaping maw where the two immense millstones met, their granite surfaces stained with a dark, ominous residue. With a shove from an Imperial guard, he was sent sliding down the smooth wooden slope. His descent was silent, a stark contrast to the machinery's roar. For a fleeting second, he disappeared from view. Then came the sound, a wet, grinding crunch that was somehow both muffled and deafening. A sound that vibrated through the stone floor and up the bones of every witness. It was not a scream, but the sound of a body meeting an irresistible, impersonal force. The great stones, driven by the relentless water wheel, did not pause or shudder. They simply consumed, grinding and mashing with a terrible mechanical efficiency. A moment later, a thick crimson paste began to ooze from the base of the stones, dripping slowly into the collection trough below. It was a horrifying amalgam of bone, flesh, and cloth, utterly unrecognizable as having once been a man. The smell that rose was nauseatingly sweet and coppery, a foul perfume of death and industry. The Emperor, standing at a safe distance on a viewing platform, watched the effluent flow with a look of profound satisfaction. This was the ultimate answer to defiance. There would be no body to mourn, no remains to inspire martyrdom. A man's entire physical existence, his secrets still locked within him, had been processed into waste. One by one, other silent prisoners were fed into the mill. Each slide down the chute was followed by that same brief, terrible crunch and the subsequent flow of the ghastly effluent into the trough. The lesson was brutally clear. The Empire's machinery was vast and unstoppable. It could build great walls and cities, and it could just as easily grind its enemies into nothingness. Loyalty meant nothing to the millstones. They honored only force and motion. Those who witnessed it left with their souls scarred, carrying the memory of the sound and the sight of the red pasta. Unequivocal statement that under the Emperor's rule, even the most steadfast will could be reduced to mere matter processed and discarded without a trace. Beyond the opulent pavilions and manicured courtyards of the main palace, hidden behind a high wall of black basalt that seemed to absorb the very sunlight, lay the Emperor's most private and terrible domain. It was not a place of leisure or contemplation, but a living laboratory of agony, a garden where the seeds of suffering were cross-pollinated to produce new and ever more exquisite hybrids of torment. Here, the Emperor's creativity, unmoored from the need for public spectacle, was given free rein to experiment in the quiet, hallowed space he called the Garden of Pain. The air within the wall was thick and strangely still, heavy with the cloying scent of night-blooming flowers, and the underlying metallic temps of old blood. The paths were not gravel, but finely crushed white bone, which crunched softly underfoot. Instead of ornamental shrubs, there were gnarled, stunted trees from which hung cages of intricate design, some too small for their occupants to stand, others lined with inward curving spikes that forced a perpetual, painful crouch. The water features were not babbling brooks, but slow, viscous channels of brine that flowed through beds of coarse salt, designed for the immersion of flayed limbs. In the center of this grotesque paradise stood the emperor himself, not as a distant observer, but as an active participant, a head gardener tending to his horrific blooms. His hands, usually reserved for holding the imperial seal, now gestured with clinical precision as his master torturers more akin to horticulturalists of horror prepared their next subject. The victim was a captured assassin, a woman of renowned fortitude, who had thus far resisted all conventional methods. She was the perfect specimen for a new hybrid technique the emperor had sketched just that morning. She was first secured to a slanted board, her feet elevated above her head. A narrow, hollow bamboo tube was inserted into her nostril, its other end connected to a slow-dripping vessel of vinegar and chili-infused water. This was not to drown her, but to provide a constant, maddening irritation, a drip, drip, drip into her sinuses that would trigger an endless cycle of gagging and suffocation sensations, without providing the release of unconsciousness. This was the first layer, the base note of her suffering. While this torment worked on her respiratory system, the emperor turned his attention to her extremities. He had read of a method used by desert tribes involving ants and honey, but he found it lacking in control. His innovation was to use a specific type of venomous centipede, its bite causing waves of fiery pain without being immediately fatal. A paste of honey and crushed lotus root was smeared on the soles of her feet and the palms of her hands, a treat to attract the creatures. Then, dozens of the wriggling, segmented insects were released from a porcelain jar, swarming over the sticky paste and delivering their venomous bites in a chaotic, crawling tapestry of pain. This was the second layer, a contrasting sensation of intense, localized burning to counterpoint the internal, dripping torment. But the emperor was not satisfied. A true hybrid required a third element, a psychological component. The brazier was brought forth, but not to brand or burn. Instead, it held a single, smooth river stone, heating until it glowed a dull red. Using tongs, the stone was not applied to her skin, but was instead passed slowly, rhythmically, just inches from her eyes. The intense, radiant heat dried her corneas, creating a searing pain in her eyes, and forcing her to blink rapidly against the assault, all while being unable to look away from the mesmerizing, hellish glow. It was a threat of blinding that never quite arrived, a perpetual promise of a new agony layered atop the existing ones. The emperor circled his subject, observing the effects with the keen eye of a master vintner, assessing a complex blend. He noted the way her body twitched from the centipede bites while her throat convulsed against the drip, her eyes straining and watering from the stone's heat. He listened to the sounds she made, a wet, gurgling choke from the tube, a sharp hiss from a bite, a low, continuous moan of ocular strain, all merging into a unique symphony of multifaceted suffering. He nodded, pleased. The experiment was a success. The Garden of Pain had yielded another fruitful hybrid, a punishment that attacked the body on multiple sensory fronts simultaneously, each agony amplifying the others in a perfect, self-sustaining loop of torment. He made a mental note to have the method documented for future use, then turned his attention to a new sketch, his mind already blooming with other darker possibilities. In the shadowed wings of the Empire's theater of pain, where the screams of the condemned were the only applause, there existed a craftsman whose skill was both revered and reviled. He was known simply as Master Feng, the foremost practitioner of the art of linki, the slow slicing. He was not a hulking brute of an executioner, but a man of slight build and unnerving calm, whose hands possessed the steady precision of a surgeon and the creative cruelty of an artist. His workspace was the raised platform in the execution square. His tools were an array of meticulously maintained blades, and his canvas was the living, breathing flesh of those who had earned the emperor's most personal attention. Master Feng did not view his work as mere butchery. To him, it was a sacred geometry of agony, a performance with a strict, unwritten code. He believed that a swift death was a mercy, and mercy had no place in imperial justice. His goal was the opposite: to sustain life and consciousness within a vessel of unimaginable pain for as long as humanly possible. To map the absolute limits of human endurance. He took a perverse pride in his record, in the number of precise cuts he could administer before the heart finally, mercifully, gave out. Each performance was a challenge he set for himself, a grim puzzle to be solved with the edge of a blade. Before each execution, he would spend hours in a small, stark chamber sharpening his knives, each one to a specific purpose. The long, thin flensing knife for the initial shallow incisions that traced the patterns of the musculature. The shorter curved blade for working around joints and tendons, the delicate hook-tipped instrument for lifting and separating skin. He would run a thumb along each edge, his expression one of deep, focused concentration, ensuring that every slice would be clean and exact, designed to maximize pain without causing immediate, incapacitating shock. When he stepped onto the platform, a transformation occurred. The quiet, contemplative man vanished, replaced by an entity of pure, dispassionate purpose. Movements were economical, fluid, and devoid of any wasted energy. He approached the bound victim not with anger or malice, but with the detached interest of a master carpenter assessing a piece of wood. His first cuts were always the same, a series of deliberate, shallow lines on the chest and arms, a waking nightmare sketched in fine, bloody lines. He worked in silence, his entire world narrowing to the space between his hand and the trembling flesh before him. He read the body's reactions like a scholar reads a text. Flinch told him where the nerve clusters were most dense. A particular pitch of scream indicated the depth of a cut. He would adjust his technique accordingly, sometimes pausing to allow a wave of agony to fully crest before administering the next, ensuring the pain did not blur into a numbing cacophony, but remained a series of sharp, distinct, and escalating torments. He took pride in the clarity of the suffering he produced, in the way he could orchestrate a symphony of screams where each note was perfectly placed. The Emperor valued him above all other executioners, often summoning him for private consultations on new methods. Master Feng would speak not of death, but of pain management, of the physiological responses to specific types of incisions, of how to bypass the body's natural shock responses. He was the Empire's foremost expert on the subject of prolonged agony, a scholar of suffering whose lectures were written in blood and whose experiments were conducted on living subjects. He retired each night to a small Spartan house, his hands scrubbed clean, his mind already reviewing the day's work and planning for the next. He slept soundly, untroubled by the ghosts of those he had unmade for. In his mind, he had not taken lives. He had simply performed his art to the best of his ability, and in the Emperor's new world that was the highest virtue a man could achieve. The Emperor's cruelty had always been a fire that burned others, but for the first time, it was designed to forge a weapon from a family's own love and use it to destroy them from within. The decree was delivered not by a herald in the public square, but by a cold-faced captain of the guard within the stifling confines of a family's home. The crime was the father's a minor official accused of keeping inaccurate census records, a bureaucratic sin that, in the new era, carried the weight of treason. The punishment was the 9 familial extermination, the total erasure of their bloodline. But the Emperor, in a stroke of psychological malice, offered a single, horrific alternative. The family, the official, his wife, his 2 daughters, and his son, a young man of 20 named Jian, was gathered in their main room, the air thick with the scent of fear and the fading aroma of their interrupted meal. The captain laid out the terms with brutal clarity. The entire family would die, their names scraped from the imperial registers, their ancestors dishonored, and their memory obliterated. Or, the son could personally behead his father. This act of ultimate filial betrayal would be accepted as a sufficient demonstration of the family's renewed loyalty to the throne. The rest would be spared. The choice was not between life and death, but between collective annihilation and a single, soul-scarring act of desecration. The weight of the decision crushed the air from the room. The mother wept silently into her hands. The daughters clung to each other, their faces pale. The father, a gentle man who had always preached filial piety, looked at his son, his eyes not filled with a plea for life, but with a profound, aching sorrow. He would sooner see his line extinguished than have his child become the instrument of his death, and carry that monstrous burden for the rest of his days. He opened his mouth to refuse, to condemn them all to a clean death together, but Jan spoke first. His voice was a hollow thing, stripped of all emotion, a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged behind his eyes. He accepted the emperor's terms. The words fell like stones into the silent room. His father's face crumpled, not in fear, but in a heartbreak so total it was its own form of death. The guards, their expressions unreadable, dragged the father into the small courtyard at the center of the house. They forced him to his knees before a rough-hewn chopping block they had brought for the purpose. They pressed a heavy executioner's sword into Jian's hands. The metal was cold, its weight immense and foreign. Jian's hands trembled violently. He looked at his father, who had taught him to write, to fish in the river, to be a good man. He saw the tears tracing paths through the man's beard, not for his own impending end, but for the damnation of his son. The courtyard, usually filled with the sounds of family life, was preternaturally quiet, the only sound the ragged breathing of his mother and sisters from the doorway. The imperial guards formed a silent, impassive circle, their presence a cage of unwavering authority. He raised the sword. The world narrowed to the sight of his father's bared neck, to the familiar slope of his shoulders, to the trust that had always lived in the man's eyes, now replaced by a devastating pity. This was the emperor's true genius. The pain of the blade was nothing compared to the psychological evisceration of this moment, the forced murder of love itself, the perversion of a son's deepest duty into an act of brutal survival. Jian's arms felt like lead, his muscles screaming in protest against the abomination they were being commanded to perform. He brought the sword down. The sound was not clean, but a wet, chopping thud, followed by a heavier, final sound as his father's body slumped to the stones. Jian dropped the sword, the clatter of metal on stone obscenely loud in the silence. He did not look at what he had done. He stared at his hands, now stained with a patricide that no water would ever cleanse. The guards nodded to the captain, their contract fulfilled. They filed out of the courtyard, leaving the family to the ruins of their life. Jian stood frozen, the architect of his family's survival and its permanent damnation. His mother and sisters did not rush to him. They huddled together, their eyes wide with a new, complex terror, the horror of what had been done, the shame of their own gratitude for being spared, and the unspoken knowledge that the man standing before them was both their savior and the destroyer of their world. They were alive, but the emperor had killed them all in a different way. He had taken their son and brother and forged him into a permanent living monument to his own power. A man who would now carry his father's ghost on his back every day for the rest of his life. The family was saved, but the home was a tomb, and its keeper was the son who had been forced to build it. The emperor's appetite for novelty had not waned. His gaze fell next upon General Kuo, a man whose loyalty had been unquestioned until a misplaced jest in his cups was reported by a sycophantic courtier. The charge was disrespect, a vague and flexible crime that perfectly suited the emperor's desire for a new spectacle. The punishment would be a perversion of a familiar comfort, the warmth of the hearth, transformed into an instrument of prolonged, excruciating death. It would be a slow roast, a method that turned the body itself into the main course of its own funeral feast. In the center of the execution square, a great fire was kindled, not for a cauldron or a branding iron, but as the sole source of heat for a macabre rotisserie. A long, heavy iron spit was suspended horizontally over the flames, its ends resting on two sturdy Y-shaped posts. The fire beneath was fed not with roaring logs, but with a bed of glowing coals, carefully tended to maintain a consistent, medium heat enough to cook, not to char. The air grew thick with the scent of wood smoke and the promise of scorching metal. General Kuo, a bear of a man with a booming laugh now silenced, was stripped of his armor and bound hand and foot. He was hoisted, struggling, and impaled upon the spit in the most literal and horrific sense. The iron rod, heated at its tip in the coals until it glowed faintly, was driven through him from back to front just below the diaphragm. A brutal violation that drew a choked, guttural scream of shock and agony from the general. The spit exited just below his sternum, and he was slid fully onto its length, his weight now supported by the cruel metal bar transfixing his core. Mechanisms at either end of the spit were then engaged, and with a series of ominous clicks, the great iron rod began to turn. Slowly, inexorably, it rotated, ensuring that the General's body would be evenly exposed to the heat from the glowing bed of coals below. The initial searing pain of the impalement was now joined by the growing, enveloping warmth radiating from beneath him. At first, it was merely uncomfortable, an oppressive heat that dried his skin and made breathing difficult. But as the minutes stretched into the first hour, the discomfort bloomed into a deep, penetrating agony. The rotation was the true genius of the torment, prevented any part of his body from receiving the merciful release of being burnt to insensibility too quickly. Instead, each inch of his skin was subjected to the heat in a relentless sequela, slow crescendo of pain as it faced the coals. A brief relative respite as it turned away only to begin the cycle again moments later. It was a rhythmic, inescapable torment that baked him alive by degrees. His skin, initially pale, began to redden, then to blister in great weeping patches. The smell that rose was not the clean scent of a cooking fire, but the nauseating, sweet odor of roasting human flesh. The General's screams soon gave way to continuous ragged moans, his voice growing hoarse as dehydration and shock set in. The world narrowed to the turning of the spit, the ache of the metal within him, and the waves of heat that washed over his blistering skin. His eyes, glazed with pain, watched the sky revolve above him, a dizzying carousel of blue and white that offered no solace. The crowd, forced to witness, watched in a new kind of horrified fascination as the powerful general was reduced to a piece of meat on a fire. His dignity and his life slowly cooked away. The emperor observed from his shaded pavilion, occasionally sipping from a cup of wine, his expression one of clinical interest. He noted the timing, the evenness of the blistering, the way the fat began to render and drip onto the coals with a soft hiss. This was not a punishment of rage, but of patience, a demonstration that the empire's power could be as slow and inevitable as a roasting fire, and just as destructive. After hours of this relentless turning, the general's movements ceased, his body finally succumbing to the massive trauma and heat. The spit continued to turn for a while longer, until the form upon it was thoroughly cooked, a grotesque parody of a feast left to cool on the iron, wrought as a stark and sickening reminder of the price of even a moment's irreverence. The emperor's quest for ever more intimate and piercing agonies had scoured the realms of architecture and nature, but it was in the simple, brutal efficiency of the artisan's workshop that he found his next inspiration. Rejecting the complex mechanics of the Iron Maiden or the biological horror of the rat torture, he desired a device of stark, undeniable violence of punishment, where the means were as plain as the result. The design was pulled from the annals of ancient punitive history and refined in the palace forges. A bed of nails, but not one designed for the fakir's trick of weight distribution. This bed was an instrument of penetration, each spike a promise of piercing finality. The bed itself was a solid oak frame, low to the ground and wider than a man. From its surface, hundreds of iron nails protruded, each one honed to a vicious point and set at a slight inward angle. They were not arranged in a pattern, but in a dense, unforgiving forest, their tips gleaming with a dull, malevolent light. This was not a bed for resting, but for impaling, and its first occupant was a captured rebel captain, a man whose defiance on the battlefield had earned him the emperor's most focused and piercing attention. The rebel was dragged forward, his body still bearing the bruises and cuts of his capture. He was a man who understood the language of violence, but the sight of the nail bed gave even his hardened spirit pause. There was no ceremony, no pronouncement of crimes. His rebellion was his crime, and the bed was his sentence. He was thrown onto the spikes, not with a shove, but with a careful, deliberate placement by the guards, ensuring his full weight would be borne by the bed's terrible surface. The initial impact was a series of sharp, simultaneous punctures, a percussive burst of pain, as dozens of points pierced his back, thighs, and calves. It was not one wound, but a constellation of them, each nail driving deep into muscle and tissue. A sharp, explosive gasp was torn from his lips, his body arching instinctively, which only served to drive the nails deeper and allow new points to find purchase in his shoulders and arms. He was pinned not by bonds, but by the very bed of his torture, a living specimen on a board of iron. But the emperor's design included a further refinement. The lesson was not merely in the piercing, but in the depth of the penetration. At the emperor's nod, guards approached with heavy stone weights. These were not dropped, but placed with grim deliberation upon the rebel's chest and abdomen. The first weight elicited a choked cry as the added pressure forced his body down, driving the nails deeper, transforming the sharp initial stabs into a deep, grinding agony. The points that had merely pierced now pressed against bone, scraped along ribs, and dug deeper into viscera. Another weight was added, and then another. With each addition, the rebel's body was pressed more firmly onto the bed, the iron teeth sinking deeper into his being. His screams became wet, gurgling things, blood welling up around the bases of the nails that studded his torso, darkening the oak frame. It was a comprehensive, all-encompassing fire, a sensation of being systematically skewered from below. He could feel the cold iron inside him, 100 individual points of violation, each one a separate locus of torment. The emperor watched from his chair, his eyes tracing the slow descent of the body onto the nails, the way the weights made the entire bed creak with the strain. He observed the precise angle of the nails, how they prevented the body from rolling off and ensured a slow, sinking impalement.
Ow.
There was no glory here, no grand spectacle, only the brutal mechanical truth of weight meeting sharpness. Of a body being incrementally consumed by a field of iron. The rebel's struggles grew weaker, his movements limited by the nails that held him fast. He was like an insect pinned in a collector's case, his final twitches a testament to the efficiency of the design. When the last weight was placed, the man fell still, his form a grotesque pincushion, the nails buried to their heads in his flesh. The only sound was the drip of his blood onto the stones beneath the bed. The emperor rose, his inspection complete. The nail bed had performed its function with perfect, horrifying simplicity. It required no skilled executioner, no fire, no complex preparation. It was democracy in agony, its nail imparting its own equal share of pain. And together, under the relentless pressure of imperial will, they achieved a perfect, piercing union of punishment and death. The air in the sacred grove was thick with the scent of smoldering sandalwood and the coppery temps of impending sacrifice. This was not the emperor's justice, but a darker, older rite, offering to the capricious gods of earth and sky, a plea for favor written in blood and bone. The chosen offering was a priest of a banned sect, a man who had preached of a merciful divinity that stood in stark opposition to the emperor's cruel heaven of absolute power. His dissent was not political, but theological, and for that, his end would be a perversion of his own faith, a ritual unbinding meant to return his pieces to the gods he served. Bound to a stone altar veined with ancient dark stains, the priest did not struggle. His eyes were closed, his lips moving in silent prayer to the very deities who were about to receive him. Around him, hooded figures chanted in a low, guttural tongue, their voices a rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the sacred fire. The high priest of the state religion, his face a mask of zealous fervor, raised a ceremonial dagger of obsidian, its edge sharper than any steel. Act! Blessed and cursed for this single purpose. The first cut was not meant to kill, but to dedicate. The blade traced a symbol on the priest's forehead, shallow incision that welled with blood, anointing him as the chosen offering. Then the true work began. The high priest switched to a smaller, hooked knife, designed not for slicing, but for precise surgical separation. The ritual demanded that the offering be taken apart in a specific order, first the extremities, then the limbs, then the trunk, each piece presented to a different aspect of the divine. The hook found the joint of the left thumb, the practiced twist and a pull that was both brutal and exact. The small bone was separated from the hand with a soft, wet pop. The priest's prayer faltered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as the pain, bright and shocking, lanced up his arm. The severed thumb was placed reverently on a small bronze plate and offered to the fire, its consumption by the flames a signal to continue. The process was agonizingly slow, a meticulous deconstruction of a living man. The knives worked with ritual precision, severing fingers, then the hand at the wrist, then the forearm at the elbow. Each piece was cleansed with salt and incense, then cast into the fire with a chanted verse, a tribute to the gods of harvest, of war, of the underworld. The priest's world shrank to the altar, to the chanting, and to the escalating symphony of pain, as he was unmade peace by sacred peace. His faith became his torture, each cut a blasphemy that screamed louder than the physical agony, his body becoming a medium for a prayer he no longer believed in. He was a message to the heavens and the earth, written by the emperor's will in the language of dismembered flesh and silent screaming devotion. The emperor's reign of terror had always been a solitary symphony, composed and conducted from the dragon throne with a cold, dispassionate hand. But a new, more intimate harmony now joined the grim orchestra, the whispered suggestions of the empress. Where the emperor saw punishment as a necessary calculus of power, a brutal engineering of fear, his wife viewed it as a form of high art, a theater of suffering where her creativity could finally find its darkest expression. She did not merely observe the spectacles from her shaded pavilion. She leaned forward, her eyes alight with a keen, almost hungry interest, her mind already working on refinements on new combinations of agony. She would later suggest in the privacy of their chambers. Her influence first manifested in subtle, chilling additions to established methods. During a public flogging, it was her idea to soak the lashes in brine and vinegar beforehand, ensuring each stroke would not only tear the flesh but sear the wound with a lingering acidic fire. She suggested the placement of braziers around the nail beds so the victim would be slowly cooked from above while being impaled from below, a dual assault of piercing and roasting. The emperor, intrigued by this new dimension of cruelty, approved her ideas with a nod. And the executioners, taking their cue from the throne, implemented them with grim efficiency. But her true artistry lay in the conception of entirely new torments. She spent hours in the palace archives, not reading poetry or history, but studying scrolls on human anatomy, on the properties of rare herbs and animal venoms, on ancient half-forgotten methods of torture from fallen kingdoms. She would emerge with sketches and ideas, her voice a soft, deadly murmur, as she described them to the emperor. She proposed a paste made from crushed fire ants and honey, to be applied to the eyes, blinding with searing pain over the course of hours. She designed a cage too small to sit or stand in, its ceiling lined with downward-facing spikes that would gradually pierce the skull of anyone who slumped in exhaustion. The emperor, whose own inventiveness had begun to plateau, found in her a boundless well of fresh inspiration. He began to summon her to his side during the planning of new punishments, valuing her perspective. Her presence added a new, unsettling layer to the proceedings. Where the court had once witnessed only the emperor's cold analysis, they now also saw the empress's delight. A particularly ingenious scream would bring a faint, genuine smile to her lips, a flicker of pleasure in her eyes that was far more terrifying than any scowl of imperial rage. She was not a passive consort. She was a collaborator, her cruelty as refined and intricate as the jewels in her hair. Her masterpiece, the one that truly cemented her role, was unveiled for a group of captured musicians who had played satirical songs about the court. She had a large, shallow bronze pan brought into the square. The musicians were bound and laid side by side within it, their heads resting on the rim. Then she ordered the pan to be filled not with water, but with a slow-acting acid, brewed from rare minerals according to her own recipe. It did not burn instantly, but gradually dissolved the flesh from their bodies over the course of a long, screaming afternoon. She watched, enthralled, as the process unfolded, noting the exact timing of each layer of dissolution, the specific pitches of agony it produced, as if critiquing a complex musical performance. The emperor watched her watching them, and in that moment, he knew he had found not just a wife, but a true partner in his empire of pain. The empress's cruelty had become an essential instrument in the symphony of fear, and she played it with a virtuoso's relish. The emperor's gaze, cold and calculating, fell upon a captured northern chieftain, a man whose broad back and fierce pride had once symbolized his people's unyielding spirit. His crime was not mere rebellion, but the audacity to claim that his gods were stronger than the emperor's mandate. For such a blasphemous challenge, a punishment of mythic proportion was required, one that would not just kill, but transform the man into a grisly offering, a testament to the emperor's divine right. The method was pulled from the darkest annals of forgotten lore, a ritual of such horrific intimacy. It was whispered to please even the most bloodthirsty of gods, the blood eagle. The chieftain was forced to his knees in the center of the execution square, his massive torso bared to the chill air. His arms were stretched and bound to two posts behind him, pulling his shoulders back and arching his spine, presenting the broad expanse of his back like a stretched hide ready for tanning. The executioner for this task was not Master Feng, but a man chosen for his knowledge of anatomy and his steady hand. A former field surgeon whose skills had been perverted to this new purpose. His tools were laid out with a surgeon's care, a sharp, heavy knife for the initial work, and a pair of iron hooks, cruelly curved. The first cut was a deep, vertical incision along the length of the spine, from the nape of the neck down to the waist. The chieftain grunted, a sharp, explosive sound of shock and pain, his muscles bunching against the ropes. The executioner worked with methodical precision, ignoring the man's shuddering, using the knife to carefully separate the skin and muscle from the ribs on either side of the spine, peeling them back like bloody wings. The pain was a deep, gouging agony, a violation of the very structure that held the man together. The crowd, held in a ring of silent, horrified fascination, watched as the executioner's hands worked, revealing the glistening white of the chieftain's ribs beneath the red ruin of his back. Then came the hooks. The executioner took them up, their polished iron gleaming dully. With a strength that belied his calm demeanor, he used them to crack and pry the ribs away from the spine, one by one, snapping them outward with wet, popping sounds that echoed terribly in the quiet square. Each fracture was a fresh wave of torment, a deep internal shattering that forced a ragged scream from the chieftain's throat. The executioner worked with a terrible patience, creating a ghastly, cage-like opening on either side of the spine. The final, most horrific act was one of grotesque revelation. The executioner reached into the cavern he had created, his hand sliding past the pulped muscle and broken bone. His fingers found what they sought, the spongy, vital organs within. With a firm, steady pull, he drew the lungs out through the shattered rib cage, laying them upon the man's own splayed and bloody back. The organs, still weakly inflating and deflating with the chieftain's agonized breaths, did indeed resemble a pair of dark, glistening wings, a brutal parody of an eagle in flight. The chieftain did not die instantly. He remained kneeling, pinned by his bonds, his body violently shuddering with the effort to draw breath through lungs that were now exposed to the open air. Each attempted inhalation was a wet, sucking struggle, a futile battle against biology itself. His eyes were wide with a pain and terror beyond comprehension, fixed on some distant point as his life slowly escaped into the square. The sight was not one of mere execution, but of a living sacrifice. A man transformed into a bloody icon of suffering, his own breath fluttering the terrible wings upon his back until the last, shallow gasp stilled them forever. The emperor observed the entire process, his expression one of profound, satisfied awe. This was more than justice. It was a dark sacrament, and he was its high priest. The emperor's latest creation was a masterpiece of deceptive simplicity, a device that promised an intimate and suffocating end. Forged in the palace workshops from cold, unyielding iron, it was known as the choking para, name that belied its horrific function. When at rest, it appeared as little more than a polished metal fruit, its segments fitting together in a seamless, unassuming sphere. But within its dormant form lay a mechanism of exquisite cruelty, a series of hinged leaves that could be slowly expanded by the turn of a threaded screw, transforming the innocuous orb into a brutal instrument of dilation and rupture. Its intended victim was a court historian who had been discovered annotating the imperial chronicles with subtle, critical footnotes. His crime was one of insidious truth, a corrosion of the emperor's crafted legacy, and for that, his punishment would be a silencing so profound it would become legend. He was dragged before the throne, his scholarly robes seeming to swallow his frail frame, his eyes wide behind their lenses with a terror that was both personal and professional. He was a man of words, and his end would be a wordless internal explosion. The emperor himself descended the dais to oversee the application of his new device, holding the cold metal pear with an artisan's pride. The historian was forced onto his back, his head held steady by two guards. His mouth was pried open with an iron gag, his protests reduced to muffled, helpless grunts. The emperor carefully inserted the closed pear into the historian's mouth, its smooth, cool surface a stark contrast to the warm, living tissue it invaded. It slid past the tongue, a metallic taste flooding the man's senses, coming to rest at the very gate of his throat. Then, With a calm that was more terrifying than any rage, the Emperor began to turn the small screw at the base of the device. The initial movement was met with a soft, mechanical click. Inside the historian's mouth, the hinged segments of the pear began to stir, pressing outward with a gentle, inexorable force. The historian's eyes bulged, a fresh wave of panic seizing him as he felt the foreign object begin to expand, stretching his jaw muscles to their limits. The pressure was a dull, aching threat, a promise of what was to come. The Emperor continued turning the screw, each rotation a measured increment of agony. The pear's leaves unfurled further, now pressing not just against the jaw, but against the soft palate and the walls of the throat. The historian's breathing became a frantic, whistling struggle through his nose. Each gasp, a desperate fight for air, as the expanding metal began to occlude his airway. His body bucked against the guard's hold, a primal reaction to the sensation of being choked from the inside, but their grip was immovable. The turning did not stop. The screw's threads ground on, and the pear expanded beyond the capacity of the human mouth. A sickening, cracking sound echoed faintly as the historian's jawbone, stressed beyond endurance, splintered. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that eclipsed the mounting suffocation. The pear continued its relentless growth, its iron leaves now tearing into the soft tissues of the throat, crushing cartilage and rupturing blood vessels. The historian's muffled sound ceased entirely, replaced by a horrific, wet gurgling as blood began to well up around the metal sphere, overflowing from his lips and tracing dark paths down his cheeks. The Emperor watched, fascinated, as the device performed its function perfectly. It was not a quick death by strangulation, but a slow, mechanical annihilation of the very apparatus of speech and breath. The pear became the center of a violent internal rearrangement, its expansion ceasing only when the screw could turn no further. By then, the historian's neck was grotesquely distended, his features unrecognizable, his life extinguished not by a lack of air alone, but by systematic, internal devastation. The Emperor carefully reversed the screw, retrieving his device from the ruined mouth. It emerged slick and crimson, its segments folding back into a perfect, unassuming sphere, leaving behind a silent historian and a court frozen in anew. Profound dread of the quiet, expanding horror the Emperor could now conjure from the palm of his hand. The Emperor's cruelty had always favored spectacle, the scream, the spray of blood, the public unraveling of a body. But for the subtle offense of a courtier who had mocked the Empress' taste in poetry with a cleverly veiled couplet, a quieter, more insidious punishment was devised. It would be a death not of moments, but of days, a slow internal decay that would mimic the rot of the courtier's own disrespect. The chosen instrument was a rare, slow-acting poison, a viscous, amber liquid distilled from a mountain flower that bloomed only in shadow, its effects as patient and inevitable as the setting sun. The courtier, a man named Li Wei, known for his wit and impeccable manners, was summoned to a private audience with the Emperor. He entered the chamber with his usual graceful composure, unaware that the cup of fragrant tea offered to him by the Emperor's own hand was his death sentence. The poison was undetectable, leaving no bitter taste to betray its presence, only a faint, floral afternote that Li Wei attributed to a rare imperial blend. He drank it down with a bow of gratitude, the warm liquid settling in his stomach like a sleeping serpent. The first day passed without incident. Li Wei attended court, his wit as sharp as ever, his movements fluid. He felt a slight, pleasant warmth in his belly, which he mistook for the lingering effect of the Emperor's esteemed tea. That night he slept deeply, his dreams untroubled. The poison was at work, not attacking, but integrating, its molecules binding silently to the very cells of his liver and kidneys, a latent doom woven into his biology. On the second day, the warmth became a persistent, low-grade fever. A dull headache settled behind his eyes, and a strange lassitude crept into his limbs. He found himself pausing mid-sentence during a debate, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a wind. He excused himself from court early, blaming a minor chill. His skin, usually pale and smooth, took on a faint, sallow hue. That evening, he could not stomach his meal, the rich flavors of braised pork and rice turning to ash in his mouth. A subtle, coppery taste lingered on his tongue. The third day dawned with a profound weakness. Li Wei's hands trembled as he tried to dress himself, the fine silks feeling heavy and abrasive against his feverish skin. The headache had intensified into a constant throbbing pressure, and a deep, aching pain had taken root in his joints as if his bones were slowly being ground to dust from within. He sent word that he was too ill to attend court, his message written in a hand that wavered and shook. He spent the day drifting in and out of a fitful sleep, his dreams filled with distorted, nightmarish versions of the imperial court where the walls bled, and the emperor's smile was a rictus of bone. By the fourth day, the internal decay became visible. His sallow skin had jaundiced to a sickly yellow and dark. Bruise-like patches bloomed around his eyes and on his abdomen. The coppery taste in his mouth was now the constant taste of his own blood, seeping from his gums. He was too weak to rise from his bed, his body consuming itself in a feverish attempt to fight the invader it could not identify. His servants, fearful of contagion and imperial disfavor, attended him from a distance, their faces masks of pity and terror. They watched as his breathing became shallow and rapid, each breath a small, painful effort. On the fifth and final day, Li Wei was little more than a husk. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, their once bright intelligence extinguished, staring at the ceiling with a fixed, unseeing glaze. His body was a map of internal ruin, his organs shutting down one by one in a predetermined sequence orchestrated by the poison. The room smelled of sickness and the sweet, cloying scent of the death that had been living inside him for days. He did not cry out or struggle. His end was a quiet surrender, a final shuddering exhalation that left his body still and empty. The news of his death was met with a knowing, terrified silence in the court. There had been no public spectacle, no blood, no scream, but the message was understood with chilling clarity. The emperor's reach was not limited to the public square. It could enter a man's body with a cup of tea and kill him slowly from the inside, turning his own vitality against him. The lingering poison was the most intimate terror, yet a death that wore the face of imperial favor. Patient, invisible executioner that lived within you, counting down the days until it chose to wake. The emperor's obsession with systematic mechanical agony had reached its zenith. Having explored the limits of skin, muscle, and organ, his imagination now turned to the very framework of human existence, the skeleton. In the deepest forges of the palace, where the fires never died and the air rang with the sound of hammers on cruel iron, his most ambitious device yet took shape. It was a contraption of chilling complexity, a symphony of levers, screws, and articulated plates designed for one purpose: to methodically break every bone in the human body, starting with the smallest and most sensitive and working inward to the core. They called it the Bone Crusher. Its first and only subject was a cartographer accused of altering imperial maps to favor rival trade routes, a crime of subtle treachery that demanded a punishment of absolute, unsubtle ruin. The man was a wiry, nervous individual, his fingers stained with ink, his world one of parchment and precision, was dragged into the throne room, which had been cleared for this demonstration. The Bone Crusher standing in the center like an iron idol. It was a chair of sorts, but one from which no one would ever rise. Its arms and legs were complex assemblies of adjustable clamps and blunt, rounded presses, connected by a series of gears to a large central wheel. The cartographer was forced into the device, his limbs secured in the clamps with a series of soft, clicking sounds that seemed deafening in the tense silence. His hands were placed palm down on small, flat plates at the end of the armrests, his fingers splayed and pinned by delicate-looking but immovable metal bands. The emperor himself approached, his expression one of intense, focused interest. He gave a slight nod to the chief engineer, who took his position at the central wheel. The process began with a low, grating creak as the engineer turned the wheel a single, precise notch. On the right armrest, a small, piston-like mechanism engaged. With a soft, metallic sigh, a rounded iron press descended onto the cartographer's right pinky finger. Just above the outermost joint, the pressure was slow, inexorable, and utterly impersonal. The cartographer's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat as he felt the hard, cold metal meet his skin and then begin to push. There was a moment of intense strain, a sensation of something being forced beyond its limit, and then a sharp, clean snap that echoed like a dry twig in the silent hall. The pain was a bright, shocking lance that shot up his arm, completely new kind of agony compared to the burns and cuts he had witnessed in others. It was a deep, structural failure, a violation of his very architecture. A short, sharp cry was torn from him, more surprise than scream. The engineer, his face a mask of concentration, turned the wheel another notch. The press reset and descended again, this time on the ring finger. Another snap, another jolt of blinding, precise pain. The cartographer's body began to tremble against the restraints, his mind reeling as it tried to process this new, incremental dismantling. The Emperor watched, mesmerized, as the machine worked its way across the right hand, methodically breaking each finger and thumb, one joint at a time. The sounds were terrible rhythmic percussion, the creak of the wheel, the sigh of the piston, the crisp, final snap of bone. Each fracture was a separate, distinct event, a building wave of agony that crested with each break and never fully receded. Layering upon the last until the cartographer's entire hand was a throbbing, useless ruin of shattered bone and screaming nerves. Then the machine moved to the left hand, repeating the process with the same unhurried mechanical certainty. The cartographer's cries became a continuous low moan, his head lolling back against the headrest, tears of pain and helplessness streaming down his face. He was a man who had made his living with the delicate movements of his hands, and the machine was systematically unmaking that identity. Fracture by calculated fracture. Once the hands were finished, the larger mechanisms on the arms engaged. Wider, flat presses descended onto his wrists. The sound this time was a deeper, wetter crunch, the breaking of larger bones surrounded by pulped tissue. The pain was a thick, nauseating wave that made him vomit weakly down his chest. The machine did not pause. It moved to his forearms, then his elbows, each break a deeper, more fundamental demolition of his body. The precision was the true horror. There was no rage, no frenzy, only the slow, inevitable, gear-driven progress of destruction. The cartographer lost consciousness several times, only to be revived by a new, more profound level of agony as the machine moved to his feet, his ankles, his shins and knees, working its way up his body with terrible patience. His world dissolved into a universe of breaking things, each snap a fresh earthquake in his consciousness. By the time the central mechanism began its work on his ribs and spine, he was beyond screaming, capable only of shallow, hitching breaths that were themselves torturous as his broken chest struggled to expand. The Emperor observed the entire process, making occasional notes on a wax tablet. He was not watching a man die. He was assessing a machine's performance, noting its efficiency, its consistency, the specific qualities of sound and reaction it produced. When the final central press engaged, designed to fracture the pelvis and spine in a single, crushing impact, the resulting sound was a deep, final shudder that seemed to shake the very floor. The cartographer's body went limp, all tension finally released. The engineer stopped turning the wheel. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint drip of the cartographer's blood onto the marble. The bone crusher had performed flawlessly. It had not just killed a man. It had deconstructed him, translating a human being into a series of mechanical actions and audible fractures. The Emperor nodded, satisfied. This was the ultimate expression of his power, not merely the ability to inflict pain, but the ability to do so with the perfect, emotionless precision of a machine, reducing a life to a checklist of breaks, from the smallest finger bone to the sturdy pillars of the spine. The lesson was clear. Even the strongest frame could be systematically crushed, and the Empire's machinery was now perfect for the task. The echo of the bone crusher's final, shuddering impact lingered in the Emperor's mind long after the cartographer's broken form had been cleared from the throne room. The perfect, mechanical precision of the device. The systematic reduction of a man to a series of audible fractures had been the pinnacle of his designs, the ultimate expression of his absolute will. Yet as he retired to his private chambers, the silence that enveloped him was not one of satisfaction, but of a strange, hollow emptiness. The screams that had once been the music of his power now seemed to reverberate inside his own skull, not as a triumph, but as a ghostly chorus of accusation. Alone in the dim light of a single oil lamp, the Emperor stared at his own hands, the hands that had held the choking pear that had sketched, the designs for the Iron Maiden that had waved aside lives with the indifference of a man swatting a fly. He turned them over, examining the lines on his palms, as if they might reveal some hidden truth. These hands had built an empire of fear, had orchestrated symphonies of suffering, and yet tonight they felt strangely alien, as if they belonged to another man. He tried to summon the image of the cartographer's face, but it was not the man's terror he saw. Instead, his mind, treacherous and unbidden, superimposed his own features onto the broken body in the machine. He felt, with a sudden visceral jolt, the cold kiss of the iron clamps on his own wrists, the inexorable pressure on his own fingers, the sharp, clean snap of his own bones. The phantom pain was so vivid, so shockingly real that he gasped aloud, his breath catching in his throat. He was not watching the machine, he was in it. The creak of the wheel was turning for him. The piston descended upon his own flesh. Cold sweat broke out on his brow. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the luxurious chamber, but he could not outpace the thought. It coiled around him, a serpent of doubt in the garden of his own certainty. He who had always been the architect of agony now found himself imagining its blueprint upon his own body. What would it feel like to be the scholar under the whip, to feel the leather tear into his own back? To be the general on the iron chair, his own skin sizzling and fusing to the metal? To be the farmer on the nail bed, the cold iron driving into his own spine? The fear was a new and terrifying sensation. It was not the fear of rebellion or assassination. Those were external threats to be met with greater force. This was an internal contagion, a sickness of the soul. He had wielded terror as a tool for so long that he had forgotten it could be felt, that it had a taste, a weight, a sound. And now it had turned back upon him, showing him his own methods from the inside out. Every scream he had ever elicited now seemed to have his own voice. Every mutilated body now wore his own face. He stood before a large, polished bronze mirror, his reflection wavering in the lamplight. The face that stared back was the face of the divine emperor, the unifier of China, the master of life and death. But the eyes? The eyes were those of a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He saw not a god-king, but a potential victim, bound and helpless before the very instruments he had created. The reflection seemed to mock him, showing him the ultimate vulnerability that lay beneath the robes and the crown. He was not invincible. He was flesh and bone, just like the thousands he had broken. And flesh and bone could be torn, burned, and crushed. A profound sense of isolation descended upon him, colder than the deepest dungeon. He had spent years building walls of fear between himself and his subjects, and now he found himself imprisoned within them, alone, with the ghosts of his own creations. The silence of the palace was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb, and he was the sole occupant, waiting for a death he had designed for others but now feared for himself. The emperor's doubts had taken root, and they grew not like a weed, but like a slow-acting poison within his own mind, showing him a future where he was no longer the architect of pain, but its final, most illustrious victim. The emperor's shadow stretched long and deep, a stain of fear that had seeped into the very soil of the empire. In the grand squares and palace courtyards, his spectacles of agony had taught the people the cost of defiance, branding the lessons of obedience in blood and screams upon their collective memory. But fear, when pressed too far, does not always shatter. Sometimes it hardens. In the quiet, hidden places where the emperor's eyes did not reach, in the damp cellars of taverns and the moonless alleys behind weavers' workshops, in the deep furrows of rain-soaked fields, the first fragile threads of rebellion began to weave themselves together. It started not with shouts or drawn swords, but with whispers. They passed from mouth to ear like a secret currency, traded in the hushed spaces between heartbeats. A farmer, his back still aching from the overseer's lash, would murmur to the blacksmith sharpening his tools about the tax collector who had taken the last of the seed grain. The blacksmith, his hands stained with soot and memory of the public brandings, would clench his jaw and whisper of a cousin in the next village who had spoken out and vanished into the emperor's dungeons. The words were cautious, veiled, but they carried a new weight, a new heat. They were no longer just complaints. They were acknowledgments of a shared suffering, a collective breaking point that was being approached with every turn of the imperial screw. The air itself seemed to change, growing thick with a tension that was different from the passive dread of before. It was a watchful, waiting tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. In the markets, people no longer just lowered their eyes and hurried past the imperial guards. Now, their downcast glances held a new, smoldering resentment. The forced attendance at executions, once met with terrified silence, now sometimes elicited a low, almost inaudible groan from the crowd, a sound not of fear, but of collective anguish and a dawning, furious empathy. The emperor's lessons in isolation were failing. Instead of fracturing the people into solitary, terrified units, their shared horror was becoming a perverse kind of glue. In the dead of night, small groups would gather, their meetings timed to the changing of the guard, their voices barely breaths on the wind. They were not soldiers or strategists, but cobblers, potters, and farmers, their weapons nothing but their rage and a desperate growing conviction that a death, fighting for a chance at freedom, was preferable to a slow death under the emperor's heel. They spoke of the stories circulating from the capital of the Bone Crusher, of the choking pair, of the empress's smiling cruelty. Each new horror, instead of cowing them further, was another log on the fire of their resolve. The emperor, in his relentless pursuit of perfect control, had made a fatal miscalculation. He had given them nothing left to lose. The whispers were growing into a single, silent, determined thought that echoed through the heart of the empire. Enough. The whispers coalesced into purpose in the deepest cellar of a disused granary on the outskirts of a river town.
Ow.
The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, old grain, and the sharp scent of nervous sweat. A single oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the faces of a dozen men and women huddled around a rough-hewn Tabula village elder whose sons had been crucified along the imperial road. A scarred blacksmith whose forge had been commandeered for the emperor's devices. A farmer's widow whose land had been seized for the emperor's gardens. And others whose lives had been carved away by the throne's insatiable cruelty. They were the unlikeliest of conspirators, bound not by ambition, but by a shared, smoldering fury that the emperor's own excesses had forged. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their words not of hope, but of necessity. The elder, his voice a dry rasp, laid out a hand-drawn map on the table, its lines shaky, but its intent clear. It showed the imperial garrison's patrol routes, the shifts of the guards at the main granaries, the weak points in the town's wooden palisade. This was not a plan for a glorious battle. It was a blueprint for a desperate, targeted strike aimed at the empire's most vulnerable point, its logistics. They would not attack soldiers. They would burn the tax grain, sabotage the weapons carts, poison the wells used by the imperial horses. Their strategy was one of attrition to make the cost of the emperor's rule heavier than the empire could bear. The blacksmith, his massive hands resting on the table like tools of war, spoke of the weapons they could forge from hidden stockpiles, not swords to meet the imperial army head-on, but farming scythes sharpened to a lethal edge, clubs studded with nails, hunting bows strung with stolen wire. Their strength would not be in steel, but in surprise. And in the righteous anger of hundreds who would rise when the first torch was lit, they would be a shadow army, striking from the fog and melting back into the populace, using the very fear the emperor had cultivated as their cloak. The widow, her eyes hard with a grief that had curdled into resolve, reminded them of their greatest weapon, the emperor's own legacy. They would use the stories of his cruelty as their rallying cry. The tale of the scholar's flayed back would be told not as a warning, but as a testament to the cost of silence. The memory of the families erased by the 9 exterminations would be invoked not to terrorize, but to unite others who feared the same fate. The Linky master's artistry would be recounted not to paralyze with fear, but to ignite a fury so pure it would override the instinct for self-preservation. The emperor had provided the kindling for his own downfall with every scream he had orchestrated. Now they would use it to start a fire. They assigned roles with a grim efficiency that belied their humble origins. Messengers, chosen for their speed and knowledge of the backtrails, were given coded phrases to carry to sympathetic contacts in other villages. Lookouts were posted at the cellar's single entrance, their ears straining for the telltale tramp of imperial boots. A young potter with a steady hand was tasked with mixing the pigments for the rebellion Sisimbala, stark image of a broken chain to be daubed on walls under cover of darkness. As the meeting drew to a close, the lamp began to sputter, its flame dying down to a fragile blue ember. In the near darkness, they joined hands, not in prayer, but in a silent oath. There were no grand words, no promises of victory, only a shared, unspoken understanding that they were already dead men and women in the Emperor's eyes, and that this knowledge was their freedom. They dispersed as silently as they had arrived, slipping out one by one into the pre-dawn gloom, carrying a fragment of the plan, a spark of the coming conflagration. The rebellion was no longer a whispered thought. It was a living, breathing thing, coiled in the Empire's heart, waiting for the moment to strike. The Emperor's cruelty had been the motivation, and now it had become his greatest vulnerability. The Emperor's reign, built upon a foundation of fear and cemented with rivers of blood, crumbled not with a climactic battle, but with the silent, swift efficiency of a knife in the night. The rebellion, a hydra he had nurtured with every act of cruelty, finally reared its many heads within his own palace walls. The very guards whose loyalty he had bought with terror, whose hearts had been hardened by enforcing his grim decrees, now turned their spears upon him. They moved not as a conquering army, but as instruments of long-overdue justice, their faces set in masks of cold resolution. They found him not on his dragon throne, but cowering in his private chambers, the architect of agony, reduced to a trembling, pitiable figure clutching at silken sheets. There was no struggle, no grand last stand. The defiance that had once defined him had been hollowed out by his own consuming paranoia, leaving only a shell of a man who understood in that final terrifying moment the precise nature of the fear he had spent a lifetime cultivating. He was dragged, not to a dungeon, but to the center of the very square where so many of his spectacles had unfolded. The stage was set not by his command, but by the will of the people whose suffering had finally found its voice. The wooden frame, the braziers, the familiar tools of his trade-all were there, arranged under the cold, watchful eyes of the crowd that had once been compelled to watch in silent terror. Now their silence was different. It was the silence of a storm held at bay, of a collective breath held not in fear, but in anticipation of a reckoning. They did not jeer or shout. They simply watched, their gazes unwavering, as the man who had been their god. And their monster was stripped of his imperial robes, his pale, soft flesh exposed to the chill air. He was forced onto the iron chair, the device he had commissioned for General Meng, its metal cold and dark until the braziers beneath it were lit with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the square. The heat began to build, a gradual, creeping warmth that quickly intensified into a blistering wave. The Emperor's eyes, wide with a horror he had only ever observed from a distance, darted across the faces of the crowd, seeking a mercy he had never granted. He found none. The cold, analytical dispassion he had so often displayed was now reflected back at him 1,000-fold. The first contact was a searing, violent agony that ripped a scream from his throat, a sound that was once the music of his power, now the testament of his downfall. His skin sizzled and fused to the metal, the smell of his own cooking flesh filling the air he had once perfumed with sandalwood and privilege. He did not die quickly. The rebellion's leaders, students of his own brutal pedagogy, ensured the heat was carefully managed, a slow, excruciating crescendo that mirrored the prolonged torments he had so loved to design. His screams, which had once echoed as lessons across the Empire, now served as its final, cathartic epitaph. Each ragged cry was a note in the symphony of his own making, played back to him on an instrument of his own design. He thrashed against the bonds that held him, his imperial dignity utterly incinerated along with his flesh, until his movements weakened and his voice faded to a wet, choking rasp. The tyrant was subjected to his favorite torture, and in his falling, the people saw not a man, but the end of an era. The reign of terror was over, its architect consumed by the very fires he had lit.